There are a lot of sources of brain fog. The most obvious one would be a poor night's sleep. Sleep, of course, being the most fundamental layer of mental and physical health. You don't sleep well for one night, you're probably okay. For 2 nights, you start to fall apart. 3, 4 nights, you're really a degraded version of yourself in every aspect. Emotionality is off, ability to do most anything is off, hormones start suffering. So sleep is fundamental. But assuming that you slept well, there are a number of things. One is your breathing patterns. We often get into discussions of breathing, but this is a slightly different one than we've had in the past. A lot of people have sleep apnea. They are not getting enough oxygen during their sleep, or they are mouth breathing during sleep. These days, it's become popular in some circles to take a little bit of medical tape and tape the mouth shut and to learn to be a nasal breather. There is excellent evidence now that being a nasal breather most of the time, as long as you're not speaking or eating or exercising hard enough that you would need to breathe through your mouth, that it's beneficial to be a nasal breather for a couple of reasons. First of all, if you are deliberately nasal breathing during the day, the tendency is that you will nasal breathe at night, which tends to lead to less sleep apnea, less mouth breathing during the middle of the night, and less brain fog.
Need motivation?
Watch the Top 10 with the Believe Nation.
Hey, it's Evan Carmichael, and I make these videos because as a young entrepreneur, I struggled to keep my business going. I had no friends, I had no mentors, I had no role models, and the thing that saved me was learning from the success stories of famous entrepreneurs. And in their stories, I got motivation, and I also got strategies for what I could do to grow my business and not stay stuck. And I still need their stories for motivation today. So today, let's learn from one of the best, Andrew Huberman, and my take on his top 50 rules for success. Enjoy.
Why brain fog? Well, during sleep, a number of restorative processes occur, but if you're not getting enough oxygen into the system, the brain is literally becoming hypoxic, and a lot of the cleaning out mechanisms, the lymphatic system, et cetera, as they're called, don't get an opportunity to function as well as they ought to. So you wake up in the morning, you slept your normal 6 to 8 hours, but you're feeling kind of groggy and out of it. And of course, there could be other reasons that you're experiencing brain fog. Maybe for people that drink alcohol the night before, maybe they had alcohol. For people that maybe they ate a meal that was too large before sleep, maybe any number of reasons, right?
Gotcha.
But getting adequate oxygenation of the brain during sleep is key. So learn to be a nasal breather. And for those of you out there that say, well, I have a deviated septum, a lot of people think they have deviated septums. The problem is they're not nasal breathing enough. The sinuses actually can learn to dilate if you nasal breathe. Exercising while nasal breathing, it will kind of depend on the sport. Like if you box, oftentimes there's the need to do a shh or, kind of like exhale on impact type thing. So I don't think anyone should tamper with their normal breathing patterns as it relates to sport or singing or some, activity. But what I'm talking about is when you're just standing around, when you're walking down the street, any low-level activity, you're working at your desk, you should be nasal breathing and breathing regularly. That will reduce brain fog in many cases. Exploring in humans is the extent to which people who can take on adaptive decisions, can take that adaptive behaviors, can take that stress response and kind of move the horizon in closer and just focus on, okay, I'm in a high stress regime. This is really painful. We see this in, we work on people with generalized anxiety who are trying to overcome fear of heights, and just walking across a virtual height plank can be terrifying for them. But if they can get one step in front of the other, despite high levels of anxiety, they can eventually overcome that. And so we've been looking at everything from how breathing affects the anxiety response to heart rate, pupil size, et cetera. I'd be happy to talk about all that in as much detail as you like. But I think the principle to take away is this, that the growth mindset is not about suppressing anxiety so that you're able to cruise through things with ease. That's just one part of it. It's really about trying to understand that stress response as key to your growth. It's absolutely key. And I think people that lift weights or run long distance or are involved in competitive sports, they fundamentally understand this, but even they kind of migrate away from it over time, where recovery is super important, but you need the stimulus, right? And the stimulus for growth is that stress response. And if you think about it, evolutionarily, let's say we were all living in a little clan here in the Onnit offices, and we didn't know anything about the outside world. We would start to kind of eventually what drove people to leave was they didn't have enough of what they needed. There's just sort of the seeking, right? So if you had enough, everything, you had enough mates, enough food, enough water, you'd be fine. But at some point there was some deprivation. And so we had to do a risk benefit analysis. And so it was really about taking that anxiety and venturing out into the unknown to find resources. Some people died and some people succeeded and they were rewarded. And with that reward came the idea that, there's something about looking out into the environment that's useful, that can allow me to have more than I have in the moment. But you can't divorce yourself from the anxiety of wondering whether or not things are going to turn out okay. You can't divorce yourself from the anxiety of strain and effort. There's just simply no way. And in fact, you weren't really designed to do it. So to kind of peel this around to a practical answer, because I often listeners and people want to know, well, what do I do with this? Is, I think the field of wellness and biohacking and high performance is great, but it lacks definition. So one thing I'd really like to see more of in these communities and in the scientific community for that matter is more careful definition. Like, what is mindfulness? Like, really, what are we really talking about? What is stress? And what are stress mitigation processes that are useful? So one thing I think is really useful is think about real-time tools versus offline tools. I believe personally that everybody, whether or not they're MMA fighter, they're into CrossFit, they're running ultras, or they're a student in class that doesn't do anything physical, whatever it is, has 4 tools. One tool to get you to mitigate your stress response in real time. So let's say the stress response hits. You need to keep it, you can't let it go too high or too low. You don't want to suppress it, but something to do that. You also probably want an offline tool that allows you to raise your ceiling on what stress feels like. I'm buds with Wim and I've known him for a long time. And I think Wim Hof breathing in particular is a useful tool for kind of shifting your perception of what stressful is. But it's an offline tool. It's not, you can do it in real time, but you're not going to start Wim Hof huffing in the middle of your rolling jujitsu because your breathing has got to be devoted to other things. So you need offline tools and real-time tools to cope with stress. And I think people need real-time tools and offline tools to bring themselves into heightened states of arousal, right? So there are times when you're actually too low on the arousal plane, and the key is to get higher up there where you can access even better levels of performance. And so I think the so-called autonomic nervous system, it's absolutely under our control. It's a total misnomer. It's just that your heart rate and your breathing are taken care of on their own. You don't need to flip the on switch. You wake up every morning and, if everything's going well, your breathing and your heart rate is going the way it should. But you absolutely have levers that you can control and move in order to shift those. And I think that there's been a lot of focus on breathing is a great tool, or, the ice bath is a great tool, but we really aren't thinking about what they're best for. And as a result of that, I don't think they'll ever evolve past where they are unless we start thinking, okay, what's the utility of breath holds? No one can tell me. So my lab is very interested in trying to figure out what the utility of breath holds is. Is it better at letting you deal with adrenaline in your system? Is it better at get carbon dioxide tolerance? For all the incredible tools that are out there, there isn't a lot of good information about systematic ways to approach it. And I don't want to peel everything down to a really reductionist approach. I'm friends with Brian McKenzie and those guys. And, and Brian's about as reductionist as you get in the breathwork community. And I love how how he loves to quantify everything. That's one of the things that initially brought us together as friends and as sort of informal collaborators. But I think that this world of biohacking needs definition. It's kind of ironic that in the weightlifting community, they've really worked things down to a kind of a fine science. Whereas in the endurance community, it's kind of like whoever you're listening to seems to be the person who knows the most. And I don't claim to know everything or the most at all. I just would like to see sharper definition on all this stuff about stress mitigation, ice baths, breathing, and so on. The discovery of growth mindset is worth thinking about. So Carol's discovery was these kids that, for whatever reason, liked doing math problems, even though they knew they couldn't get the answers right. These were sure fail problems. So it's the same kind of people that like doing puzzles. And these kids, not surprisingly, go on to do phenomenally well in a number of different areas of academic pursuit. But what's interesting about growth mindset is that it seems like there's some attachment of the reward systems of the brain to the action or the pursuit of a goal, not just achieving a goal. And when we step back and we look at what that really entails at a neurochemical level, we have reward systems in the brain. They generally fall into 2 categories. There are the reward systems that make you feel really good with kind of the here and now and everything that's within the confines of your skin and the things you already have, love of your dog, love of your spouse, gratitude for all the things you happen to have. And those are generally governed by the release of molecules like serotonin and oxytocin.
okay? But then there's another reward system, which is the one that drove a lot of human evolution, which is the dopamine reward system. Now, dopamine is a very misunderstood molecule. It's often talked about only in the context of reward. Like, I'm going to work to this goal, I'm going to build my company, I'm going to, get tenure as a professor, whatever it is, and you reach it and you get this dopamine reward. And indeed, that's true. But what's often not discussed is that dopamine is secreted en route to rewards while you pursue rewards. Now, the ability to tap into that system, to subjectively amplify that pathway of reward in pursuit of goals, is an absolute game changer when it comes to things like anything challenging that of long duration or uncertainty or getting through this COVID, pandemic situation. But the amazing thing is, remember, the brain only does 5 things, and we get to decide which of those sensations and perceptions have relevance and which ones don't, or which ones are attached to a goal and which ones aren't. So growth mindset, in its purest form, is the attachment of these reward systems to the effort process, to the friction process, and not just to obtaining a reward. And just as a kind of final point to that, there's a very well-known body of literature in neuroscience, at least among neuroscientists, that talks about something called reward prediction error. And it says, if you can dose the dopamine subjectively as you go through the pursuit of something, and then have a lot of dopamine when you reach that thing, it's very likely that you're going to reinforce that circuit. There will be neural plasticity, and that circuit will become stronger. So the next time you will revisit those sets of behaviors. The opposite can happen too, where you're in real anticipation of something. This is going to be great. This is going to be great. This is going to be great. And then you reach that goal and it's kind of underwhelming. And that generally triggers this circuit that I referred to earlier, this kind of disappointment or pro-depressive circuit. So dopamine is involved in reward, but it's also involved in the pursuit of rewards. And so as you reach a milestone, or as you tell yourself, I'm on the right track, this friction I'm feeling, this late night, this early morning, this hard conversation with somebody that doesn't feel good, I'm going to tell myself this is for a larger purpose. That's that subjective insertion, that abstraction that we were talking about earlier. And when you start releasing dopamine to those kinds of things, there's essentially no limit on the number of things you can do or the energy to do them. So just as a last point about dopamine, when we're in effort, we're always secreting adrenaline. We're always in pursuit, and it's draining. It's tiring. Dopamine has this beautiful capacity to buffer adrenaline. And you know this, you've experienced this before, because if you've ever been working really, really hard, maybe your team is depleted, everything's just a mess, and somebody cracks a joke, and all of a sudden, in an instant, it's like everything's reframed. That couldn't have been hormonal. Hormones work on the schedule of like hours to days to weeks. It had to be neurochemical. It absolutely had to be neurochemical, and that neurochemical is dopamine.
We've all heard the sayings, how do you, journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. Or how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? Mm-hmm. Or, there are all these sayings, and it goes back to the Bible and earlier, yeah. Right? I mean, this is not new. These are not new sayings, but they're showing up in different forms. What's lost in those short descriptions, however, is that every step is not equivalent. If it were just that a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, everyone would pursue their goals. Everyone would push back against adversity. You can read the inspirational stories as many times as one needs, and I do think inspirational stories are of very high value. In fact, I think they're vicarious dopamine. I think they give us the sense that we could, which then orients us to the world again.
So right. Maybe it's possible for me.
That's right. So let's say, let's take the example of somebody who's...
but just to finish that story of, it's not about just taking a single step and one step at a time. Is it because there's adversities every 10 steps you go, and so it's harder and harder? So it's not just
it's just very nonlinear. Yeah. It's some days go, I know this from my scientific career, it's, some days it's easy, some days it's hard, it's all over the place, mm-hmm. Right? So I think the thing to remember is that dopamine is this incredibly powerful molecule that allows us to buffer the effort process. It allows us to be in effort longer, and it allows us to actually eventually enjoy the process of effort.
And not think about the reward, but just say, I'm enjoying the process.
Right. Well, you just described the first step. The first step in learning to attach dopamine to the effort process, which is the key operation in order to succeed, is to be very careful about how much you focus on the end goal. Keeping the goal in mind is important for like a proper orientation. You have to know the ultimate destination. But if at any point we were to evaluate our progress relative to that end goal, or if we don't know what the end goal is, there's a huge gap there, and it can feel overwhelming.
And depressing, and I'm not good enough,
That's
and
right.
I should just give up. What am I doing this for?
That's right.
And those thoughts will affect us.
And they're very realistic, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as Carol will say, and other people have said in the psychology field, positive self-talk, oftentimes, unless you do it correctly, you're badly wrong. Lying to yourself won't work. Saying I'm a winner, when you haven't
lost,
or you haven't won yet,
Yeah.
is great, but that's not the most effective use of these systems.
Well, you're also being out of integrity with yourself. You're telling yourself a lie.
Right.
You're like, and then you're losing your ability to have confidence because you're just lying to yourself.
Right. And if it's really extreme, there's a name for it. It's called delusional, right? Right. And people will start to point that out, and then it becomes harder to recruit people into your goals. So I think the key thing is to attach that sense of reward to the effort process. It's saying, look, I am oriented in the right direction and rewarding the things you're not doing. I'm not back on my heels. I'm not just staying, in bed in the morning. A good example of this came to me recently. I have a good friend. He did 9 years in the SEAL teams. His name is Pat Dossett, and we were talking about the Admiral McRaven thing. Get up and make your bed, and they really do that. And I think the way it was described was, so at the end of the day, even if everything doesn't go well, your bed is still made. Mm-hmm. For me, that's not that big of a reward, frankly.
Right.
So I said that, and
I love it though. I make my bed.
I definitely make my bed in the morning, but I mean, going back and seeing that at the end of a hard day, it's not enough. I felt like there was something else there. So I asked him. He said, "Well, it's very interesting because part of it is about not just making your bed, but it's the things you're not doing." By making your bed. You're not lying in bed and ruminating. You're not back on your heels.
You're not on your phone.
That's right.
Yeah.
So when you look at, and you have spent a lot of time with people in high-performing communities, mainly through some consulting work, but what you find is that, we can all either be back on our heels, flat-footed, or forward center of mass.
Yeah.
And when you look at people who are in these high-performance communities, they try and keep their center of mass forward, almost through what seem like trivial things like making your bed or making the cup of coffee, but it's not just about what you're doing, it's all the things you're not doing that can put you down the path of ruminating or put you down the path of unhealthy behavior. So the key to this is, if we want to be very concrete, we should probably focus on actions, and I'll use fitness as an example because it translates to everybody, whereas people's circumstances differ. Let's say somebody really wants to take on a fitness routine. They hate running, or they want to lose weight in a healthy way, this kind of thing. So we've all heard the example, well, you put your shoes by the door on day 1. Day 2, you put them on. Day 3, you go out the door. Day 4, you walk around the block, and then, and then eventually they're running marathons. Okay, great. But to sustain that behavior, or even to make the behavior pleasurable and to give you energy, the key is to subjectively reward those steps. So it's not going to be, let's say I go out and I run a mile, and my goal is to run 10 miles in a few weeks. The key is, as you're in the strain of that mile, the hard part, you want to tell yourself, this is the good part. This is the part that gives me energy. And I'll be very surprised if people don't actually feel like they could continue further. So it's a journey of 1,000 miles starts with is made up of, single steps. But the key is to reward the harder steps, not the easier ones, and not the ones where you get the thing that you want.
Don't reward yourself for putting your shoes on and taking a step outside.
You could if that was a huge barrier for you.
If it's very hard.
If it was very hard for you.
Running the 10 miles is hard.
Right. Find the wall and push a little bit further through that wall and reward that process. So this is why I think reps in the gym, the final reps, like reps to failure, are usually not the best example. First of all, most people aren't doing reps to failure, and it doesn't translate to young kids and stuff where they probably shouldn't be doing heavy reps to failure, this kind of thing. What you want, however, is if you're going to go there, to think about this is the hard part, because that's when adrenaline, norepinephrine are getting maxed out, and that's when you have an opportunity to bring dopamine in and teach those neural pathways to slam that back down. And I don't want to highlight them too much because they are a very niche and specialized community, but you look at people in special operations, you look at the process, like the whole evaluation process of who gets in and who doesn't. It's really about putting people into stress and seeing who can not just make it through that stress, but buffer that stress. Reward the process through teamwork, reward the process of stress through some internal dialogue that has everything to do with not being back on your heels, not being flat-footed, but center of mass forward. And I should also be clear, I'm not talking about everybody being super aggro and always like,
work. Yeah.
In fact, if you're spending too much epinephrine, if you're too much of an adrenaline junkie, you will burn out eventually, unless you can find ways to recover yourself or to buffer that with dopamine. And the recovery process is especially important. There's a second reward system. So you've got the dopamine system, and I guess to really put a box around it, the subjective reward needs to be done at the hardest portion of a process. The tough conversation with a significant other, it's like when it's really tough and that's when you want to start telling yourself, this is the good part because I'm not speaking, or this is the good part because
I'm not reacting.
Right, I'm not reacting, or this is the good part because I'm probably not doing it correctly, but I'm on the right path, right? They're upset, they're not feeling your empathy, this kind of thing, or you're not really understanding what's going on, you're getting frustrated. But if you tell yourself, this is the neural pathway getting ground in there, like it really dialed in, so that the next time I'm going to breeze right past this. Yeah. That's really how the process works. Because remember, no one comes along and drips dopamine in your ear, even if you get $1 billion, or you win a Nobel Prize, or you win the presidency. It's all internal. These neurochemicals are all internal. And while some of them are designed to be released in response to things very reflexively, like food, sex, sleep, all these things will trigger these neurochemicals, we have this big forebrain which allows us to place subjective context on things.
Also, to make sure you're actually taking action after watching this video, I've designed a special free worksheet just for this video. The worksheet will highlight all of the lessons learned in this video, as well as pull out our 3 favorite learnings and quotes that will inspire you to actually do something. The worksheet will also give you space to write down what your key takeaways are and your specific plan of action to make sure you're getting results. If you want the worksheet designed specifically for this video, absolutely for free, there's a link in the description below. Go click on it and start building the momentum in your life and your business. I'll see you there.
And whether or not that competition is with, mental material like books and studying, or whether or not it's physical competition, we need external influences. Like I think these days we're so attracted to the idea that we can, control everything from the inside, but you need human interaction. It's absolutely necessary. And I think that, it sort of harkens back to the story at the beginning. It's like all the stress and that I was going through in those years. I mean, it absolutely made me better, right? Absolutely made me better. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I don't wish hardship on people, but humans are remarkable in their ability to step into challenge and to meet challenge. I think that there's this important and very, very serious conversation now about mental health, right? The number of people suffering is just tremendous. But I think that we also are forgetting that, that suffering process it's a jumping off point, right? And I've had a number of friends commit suicide. I understand just how, that's a horrible tragedy, and depression is absolutely terrible. But there's also this question of, sort of like, what is our expectation about our mood, right? Like what are we really trying to achieve with our moods? And so I always say, there are 5 things that embody our whole existence. It's like our sensations, what we feel, our emotions, our perceptions, our thoughts, and our actions. That's pretty much it. And of all of those, the emotions are the most mysterious. It's kind of a combination of perception and thoughts. You can control your behavior. You can control your thoughts. People often forget this, but your thoughts are your choice, right? I'm not saying you can suppress thoughts. I think there's been a lot of attention on trying to learn how to suppress thinking. I've never been able to suppress thinking, ever. But what I can do is introduce new thoughts. Actually, Stephen Pressfield, who wrote The War of Art, brilliant author and ex-military guy, he really, I think he said something like, he was like in his mid-40s before he had his first real thought. And what I like to think he was referring to was the first time that he realized that you could actually introduce a thought, that thoughts aren't just all spontaneous, so they can be deliberate. Your sensations you can control by your environment, and your perceptions are largely about kind of like what sense your thoughts about what you sense. right? But your feelings, I think we overvalue feelings. And here I'm going to come across as, kind of a hardened male and about this. I would place myself actually kind of on the wide emotionality scale. But I've learned over the years that emotions are just kind of a mishmash of perception and thought. I think we overvalue their utility. And this is just my opinion. I don't have any scientific data to support it, but I also don't even know how you study emotions in the lab. Every time I see a laboratory that claims they study emotions, they're studying behavior. Every time people are talking about fear and about courage, they're talking about a behavior that's measured. We don't know what these animals feel. We don't have the foggiest. I don't know what you feel right now. I barely understand what I feel right now. So I think that as a species, and in terms of mental health, we've been over-focused on feelings. And I think we need to think more carefully about physiology.
Everyone knows that the brain is very plastic early in life. So from birth until about age 25, you can learn so much, for better or for worse. I always say the downside is that early in life, you have less control over your life circumstances, but your brain is very plastic. So there's a dark and light to that. Later in life, you have a lot more control generally over your life circumstances, but the brain becomes less plastic. However, we know, based on Nobel Prize winning work and recent work in addition to that the neuromodulator acetylcholine is secreted when we pay attention to something very specific. It acts as sort of a spotlight in the brain, making certain synapses, the connections between neurons, more active and more likely to be active again than others. So when you hear that song that you love so much and it moves you and you feel dopamine being pulsed into your body, that's a real thing. You're actually getting dopamine secretion. You've formed that deep association with that. And acetylcholine draws your attention to that. And that song is essentially wired in a very indelible way into your nervous system at multiple. You can probably even with certain songs, you can feel your body start to energize because, of course, the brain through connections with your muscles controls your body. So for things that are traumatic or negative, what we're really talking about is neuroplasticity that's focused on unlearning. And most of the therapies for this, whether or not it's EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, or it's traditional psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, or it's somatic embodied release, big, Kundalini breathing type, almost all of those are designed to do something, which is to bring the person, or you bring yourself, into a state of heightened alertness, right? You can't do this stuff when you're sort of half asleep. Heightened alertness, and then focusing your attention on the traumatic or negative event. This is the way that it works. And then pairing that with something new. Traditionally, this was done with things like NLP or in talk therapy, where people would feel the positive relationship with the therapist. That was kind of the main rationale in association with this very traumatic, sometimes even, shameful type events. And the idea is that you would simultaneously have those two experiences, the negative one and the feeling of safety, and you would rewire those circuitries. I actually believe that can work, but it can take a lot of times. It can take a lot of visits to the therapist, which is not to say it's bad. It's just not everyone has access to those resources. Things like eye movement desensitization reprocessing, simply moving the eyes laterally while recounting these negative events. The woman who devised this figured out that somehow when people recount these traumatic experiences, when they're doing these lateralized eye movements, not vertical eye movements, they somehow separate out the negative emotions. And I thought for years, people would ask me about this stuff, Tom, and I thought, this is ridiculous. First of all, I'm a vision scientist and I work on stress. It's like, there's no way. And then I really ate my words, because 4 papers, 2 in humans, 2 in mice, and then a 5th paper published in Nature, which is kind of our Super Bowl of scientific publishing, showed that these lateralized eye movements quiet the amygdala. They actually suppress activation of this threat detection center in the amygdala. And
why would that be true?
So this is really where it gets cool. Turns out, because of the way that we view the visual world when we move through space, when our head moves or when we walk and things flow past us, that these lateralized eye movements are what happens when you move forward in space, when you're walking, when you're moving forward towards something. And that suppresses activation of the amygdala. Now you say, why? Well, okay, so then 2018, my laboratory did an experiment. There was actually a graduate student in my laboratory where we're looking at fear. In this case, we were looking at fear to big looming objects that either trigger freezing or running and hiding. There's a brain area that's in your brain and my brain that mice also have that triggers a third option, not run and hide, not freeze, but forward confrontation. This is the, no, I'm going to fight. I'm going to move forward in the face of adversity. This is the growth mindset. I'm going to lean into friction. And it turns out that this circuit is linked to the dopamine reward pathway. When we move forward in the face of a threat, and obviously we want to do this in healthy, adaptive ways, we suppress activity of the amygdala through physical action of moving forward, and there's a signal sent to the areas of the brain that control dopamine reward. Those reward centers then trigger the release of dopamine to reward forward effort in the face of stress or threat. So when you hear about people saying, look, take some physical action when you're feeling exhausted. Take some forward physical action when you're feeling overwhelmed by this traumatic experience. Now, that could be in the form of a walk. Now, this therapist, she figured out with EMDR, because you can't take people walking around for therapy sessions, she figured out that these lateralized eye movements are what triggers suppression of the amygdala. And it makes perfect sense because the amygdala, this threat detection center in our brain, it doesn't connect to the limbs. So how does it know if you're moving forward? Well, because the eyes are moving. You have these reflexive eye movements that move anytime you're moving through space. So to make this a little more succinct, it's really forward movement, action, pushing yourself across that threshold. Not only rewards you, but it suppresses activity of the fear centers in the brain. And these are ancient hardwired mechanisms. These aren't hacks. These are things that Mother Nature installed in us.
I suggest people avoid layering dopamine. You know, you have one dopamine system that fortunately can be activated by a lot of different things. So for instance, I love the feeling of being completely rested, going into the gym or going for a run mid-morning after a cup of coffee, hydrating well, using the bathroom, listening to my favorite music on a sunny day. But that's a lot of things layering in for dopamine. And what happens is that if that becomes your hope and expectation, fine. But if that becomes your requirement for actually having a great run or workout, you're in trouble because the next time it's not going to be that exciting and you're not going to be that motivated. You actually won't perform as well. So this year, what I've been doing is every third or fourth workout or so, I think kind of randomly, I leave my phone in the car. I don't use any music and I don't allow myself any kind of pre-workout stimulant. So I have to generate all the force and energy and everything I'm going to do from internal processes. And you might say, well, that's kind of masochistic. Why would you do that? It's supposed to be fun. Well, I'll tell you, when the next time when you bring your headphones and you're listening to music, you feel like a god in there. Why? Because you are secreting so much more dopamine, so much more noradrenaline, so much more effective at performance. But then the next time you have to throttle it back. And so I'm excited by all the tools that are out there, all the, there's all this like cognitive enhancement stuff and people are plugging into every device and they're trying to figure out, do I have white noise in the background or metronomes and all that stuff. But it's good to not layer in too many things. There are other examples of this where are a little more unfortunate. Pornography is a really good example. There's a huge issue now, right? Because pornography is so much more readily available on the internet. Now let's just remove the kind of the moral judgments about it, right? Because that's not what this is about. A scientific discussion about this would say that there's an enormous availability and range of imagery that's very powerful that feeds directly into the dopamine system. And a lot of people, young people who are growing up watching a lot of intense pornography are suffering from a lot of sexual side effects and struggles with sexual interactions in real life because those interactions are not as intense as the things that they're seeing. The other thing that's happening, I should just mention, is that I have colleagues that work on this in psychiatry that they are wiring their nervous systems to become aroused viewing other people having sex as opposed to them having it. And so they're running into a lot of trouble there. So what's happening is that dopamine levels are so high that real life it's like eating extremely palatable foods that are just blitzing your system, every taste bud, high salt, high sugar, high fat, to the point where it's just, and let's assume delicious. I don't generally like those kinds of foods, and then all of a sudden it's like, here's a bowl of rice or a salad. It's going to taste like garbage to you because you're at first anyway.
That's also got to be sort of trickling over to just social media in general and the dopamine release in response to that versus, say, for example, a real life conversation. Right.
Well, and if you're on social media and you're scrolling and you don't even know why you're scrolling, like you don't even know what you're looking for, your dopamine system has been tapped out and you need to take a break from it. Maybe a couple hours, maybe a couple of days. I think social media is great. I teach science on social media. I see you all the time on social media. There's a lot of great social interaction. There's a lot of opportunity to learn and see things. Some are funny, some are interesting, some are disturbing. But when you're at the point where you're engaging in something and you don't even know what the win is, but you find yourself reflexively engaging in it, your dopamine system is now plummeting. And that's a serious issue. So the other thing is that a picture is worth 1,000 words and a movie is worth 1,000 pictures. Our visual system is so tuned to watch motion and to see movies. So you're seeing movie after movie after movie after movie. What's happening is the context is switching constantly. The human brain has never been confronted with context switching at this rate. A television went from 6 channels to 12 to 200, but this is the first time that you can walk around with your television. You can have it in your car. You can have it on the phone, on the plane. So I use social media and the internet a lot. Unlike email or reading an article online, social media is, you can scroll through 1,000 different or 100 different contexts within 5 minutes. And that's a big override for the brain. And then the rest of the world seems kind of boring. Like, you see people at dinner scrolling their phone. It's because actually the brain wants novelty. It's seeking novelty all the time. These days, I'm turning off my phone in the evenings. I'm on there a little bit, but I'm finding I'm kind of sick of the phone. And I think a lot of people are kind of hitting this point where they're like, I'll get on social media for an hour or two a day, but this is getting a little pointless. I think that an ability to know that things pass, an ability to know that what you're feeling in the moment is not a permanent state and doesn't necessarily return, an ability to know that your identity 10 years ago hopefully isn't your identity now, and you can actually transform your identity over time, is immensely powerful. It's when we get into these locked regimes of who we are, how we feel, how we think, that kind of the impending doom really takes over. Not to be dramatic about it, but everyone I know that isn't able to adopt a kind of different ideas about how things could be different on the outside and on the inside is suffering, right? And everyone I know that has the kind of mindset, unfortunately, I happen to know a lot of people like this, that understand that, your internal state is something you can shift with exercise, with movement, with ice bath, with breathing, with whatever your particular leanings are, then they seem to understand that grabbing hold of that internal real estate first is kind of a door that opens my world and my life is actually something I completely control. And so this portion of the conversation might not seem that scientific, but it's absolutely scientific in the sense that the brain is a time-space statistical guessing machine. It just wants to know what's coming next. That's all it wants to know. And so if you can start to expand the notion of what could come next, you really start to open up possibility. And in possibility, you start to open up the physiology of the body to explore. And in exploration, you get different outcomes. So these, I think, this kind of mystical or abstract level of the conversation is really at the core of what human beings are best at, which is using the front of our brain to conceive new ways of doing things. This is the reason we run the planet and other animals don't. Is my dog Costello doesn't wake up and say, I want more food. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tomorrow, he just basically is he does what he needs to get what he needs in the moment. We're the planners. And in planning, we can do so much more. But in planning, it's also where we suffer if we plan to feel the same way. So in a lot of ways, we're planning to feel the same way.
When you start thinking about things like growth mindset in terms of how they convert to neurochemical signatures, it leads us to this place of, okay, if it's all subjective, then, if I just say, look, I'm going to stand up out of my chair and that's going to feel amazing, is that going to work? Well, no, it depends on the meaning that I attach to something. And this subjective part can be a little tricky and a little bit hard for people. So I want to try and lay it out in a concrete way so that if they want to apply this, they can. Incidentally, or not so incidentally, I should say, when you look at communities of very high performers, and I'm fortunate enough to do some consulting with some people from special forces communities and so forth, they're very good, as are you, at attaching reward to specific behaviors in subjective ways. So growth mindset and these dopamine rewards that we subjectively apply are not about saying, I had a terrible day, I performed poorly, but you know what, it's great, I just feel great anyway. It's not about that. It's not about attaching your sense of reward to the ultimate goal. It's about attaching your sense of reward to the fact that you're making action steps that are generally in the right direction. The more you can reward the effort process, the better off you are at building these kinds of neural circuits and these kind of tendencies to be able to lean into anything challenging over essentially any duration. So how does this work? Like, how would somebody do this, right? Well, keeping in mind that adrenaline and epinephrine are all great for getting us into action. This is Mother Nature's way of chemically making us feel kind of agitated. Remember, stress was designed to agitate us, to move us away from things and toward things. But realizing that that's a limited resource, that eventually that same chemical is what makes you have a negative mindset. It feels painful. It's the burn in your body. It's uncomfortable. And realizing that dopamine can push back on that neurochemically. It can suppress those sensations of wanting to quit. You say, well, then how do I get this dopamine to work for me before I hit a goal? Because not every day is going to be a real win. There's some days, I mean, I know from my science career, there were days that were really hard. Experiments didn't work. Papers got rejected. And yet, I've spent 2 decades or more just drilling on and drilling on. And it's been a sheer pleasure at times. But there's been, some pain points along the way. So what is this process really about? And how would somebody implement these dopamine and epinephrine type neurochemical events in their own life? Well, we all know the example of like wanting to run a marathon. I've never run a marathon, but that'd be a nice goal to have. Let's say tomorrow morning I set my shoes near the door. Now, a lot of people have talked about this. Day 1, you set your shoes near the door. Day 2, you go out the door. Day 3, you run around the block. Day 4. But the key thing is not just to go through the actions, but when you hit each one of those self-designated milestones, the milestones that you're setting out for yourself, you have to pause for a moment and tell yourself, I'm heading in the right direction. I haven't run the marathon yet, but this is the foundation upon which I'm going to lay another foundation, upon which I'm going to lay another foundation. And those little pulses of dopamine allow you to get that action step without the depletion that it would normally bring. Otherwise, it's like you're spending money. This is like replenishing this bank account that you have, and it's a neural bank account. And so dopamine is the thing that you can control the dosing of. And so if you say, today it's my shoes at the door, but tomorrow it's around the block, and that's it. But that's in the direction I want to go. What you do is you now get those 2 events, plus the next day, the mile-long runner, and so forth, without it depleting you. It actually builds this capacity to build more reward. And this is what you've done. This is what people from elite special forces can do. They know how to make small, simple, physical steps in the real world that allow them to build on these reward circuitries, but they don't get delusional about how they're doing. They know, they keep the end in mind, but they get very micro. They move the horizon in very close. And so if you can move the horizon to something you can complete and you reward that, you essentially are where you were before. You're just as strong, if not stronger, but you're heading in the direction you need to go. You're not depleting. You're not spending out anything. And it feels a little weird because none of us like to reward things that aren't external. But the ability to control these internal reward schedules is everything.
Learning is a 2-stage process. And the learning I'm referring to is specifically deliberate learning. Children are learning passively all the time. They're taking in new information. Their brain it's not a complete tabula rasa. It's not a complete blank slate. There's some hardwired functions they show up with, thank goodness, like breathing, like heart rate, controlling heart rate.
That helps.
But that helps. I mean, offload as much as you can to the genetic program to hardwire the nervous system so they can learn how to walk. And walking is a good example. A kid learns how to walk and then walks reflexively. But of course, at any stage, you can think about how you're walking. You could do hopscotch, and you have to change your cadence of jumping and walking, right? So that's this flexible transition between voluntary and involuntary movement. But you have to learn how to walk. What we're talking about now is generally deliberate learning, language learning, skill learning, learning knowledge of any kind, learning how to, navigate the emotional dynamics of a relationship, anything. 2 phases. One is active engagement and focus. Much of the trigger for neuroplasticity as a process is engaged by dopamine and norepinephrine and a molecule called acetylcholine, which is liberated from multiple sources. We always talked about how acetylcholine controls the contraction of muscles, but in the brain, acetylcholine mainly comes from 2 sets of neurons, one in the brainstem and another in the basal forebrain. And it serves as a kind of a highlighter, marking particular connections or neurons that later stand a chance to become stronger. So let me give an example. I don't speak a second language, but let's say I decide I was going to learn conversational French. I would learn some nouns or some verbs. I would I would focus on this. And the greater degree of focus that I bring, the greater amount of acetylcholine is released at that time. And at the particular locations in the brain, they're involved in enunciating the words and writing the comprehension, multiple spots within the brain. That kind of marks those or flags those areas as potentially changing later. But the actual rewiring of the nervous system happens during states of deep sleep or sleep-like states. And so so when we say neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change in response to experience, that's a two-part process. It's a process. It's not an event. We always think about things as events, but in biology, almost everything is a process. So the takeaway from this is, in order to learn at any age, the most critical thing is that you bring as much focus and active engagement to the learning, the encoding of the information, bringing in the information. And then that you get into a state of deep rest as quickly as possible. Typically, that would be the night after you learn, after you have this trigger. But there are some beautiful studies published in Cell Reports last year and the year before showing that people who take a 20-minute nap within the 4 hours after these triggering learning, or people that do a non-sleep deep rest type protocol, even just sitting there quietly and not doing anything, they learn much faster. In other words, the brain rewires much faster.
Isn't that interesting?
It's very interesting. And what's happening is very interesting. We've long known that during sleep, there's a replay of the neurons in the same sequence that they were played during the activity in the earlier in that day. Sometimes even backwards for some reason. It's like the song's played backwards at night. Who knows why? I don't think we should focus too much on that right now. But that replay is the consolidation of the information. You learn. This is why you try something physically, try it physically. You can't do it. And then you come back a week later and voila, you can do it. You had the opportunity to change the neural circuits so that now you can do it. If people out there think that the moment you start achieving some success, that things are going to get easier, it gets worse. There are more opportunities, and therefore your structure gets disrupted. More email, more texts come in, more amazing possible relationships and places to eat and things to do. It actually starts to undermine the whole process if you're not careful. I have a list, and now I make it every day, because when I just put it next to me and I didn't write it out, it didn't work. But it literally starts: dog walk number 1, get sun. I mean, like really basic stuff. Get sunlight. Then I do a 90-minute work block, which means I use the program Freedom on the computer. No internet, no phone. I turn off the phone. I put it in my car. Sometimes it's really bad. I mean, the phone it's such a pull. Ask me for some code to get into something, and then I think I need the phone. Next thing I'm doing something else. So 90-minute work block. But what's beautiful is that the nervous system, and I don't know the underlying basis of this, but the nervous system has this feature to it where when we take the chaos of choice and we restrict ourselves to one of those choices, you get a neurochemical payoff. And it comes in the form of dopamine. But there's something about activities that are forced restriction to one particular focus, right? So I'm going to write for 90 minutes, or I'm going to think for 90 minutes, or I'm just going to walk the dog. I live in an area now where I don't get reception on my dog walks. And at first it was excruciating. I love it now. It's like I just walk the dog. And there's mornings where I have a bulldog. He does not like to walk. So I'm like, I got to get back, and I'm frustrated. And and it's hilarious, right? Because I notice myself and the way that my tripwire to agitation is so slight. I'm like one of these people, I can just, in a second, I'm aggravated because it's not happening as quickly. And so I've learned to make the whole walk a process of me just like recognizing these features of myself. And my bulldog Costello just plods along. He could care less, right? So the walk is it's only about walking the dog. And the email, if it's email, is only about checking email. Right. And there's something valuable to this. And I think the brain loves this when we give it this. And the brain, unfortunately, is also happy to just take a smorgasbord of pseudo-random thoughts and actions all day, every day. But there's something so deeply satisfying about focus. And I think we could all benefit from doing more of that. It's just so hard to do. And I'm not an anti-phone guy. I'm from Silicon Valley. I use the phone. I'm addicted to my phone. I admit it. I'm addicted to my phone. But I'm trying really hard to cultivate a different relationship to it. Because I think that now that it's 2021, I think looking back, phones, we've had them for about 10 years. There are so many examples of ways in which they erode our best relationship to life, so many ways, that I don't think we should get rid of them, but I think we really need to start being conscious of the ways in which they're eroding our productivity, our creativity, our relationships. And I don't have any obvious answers to this. I just have tools that I use and that I've found to be of benefit. But I think in the next 5 years, we are going to see a shift toward people really moving away from phones in as much as we use them now. I have really tried to adopt this idea that when it's inevitable, and it will inevitably arrive, that stress grows us, that it really sharpens decision making. It really sharpens decision making. And you know, if you have a very stressful event and then you recover from it, the worst thing to do is just go and keep going. You need to take some time and reflect about what led into that. So I think I'm very good at leveraging fear into positive change. If I really think about most of the major shifts in my life, it was, I'm scared as hell to remain in this situation, and I'm very good at broadcasting fear into my future. You know, if I've ever been in a bad relationship, it was clearly, if I stayed in, it couldn't have been so bad that I felt like I had to leave. So I would broadcast and project, you know, how horrible it would be for my future children. And I might even build that up a little bit in my system. Now, one could say, well, maybe you could have navigated it successfully. I'm better at projecting fear into my future. And that has led me to make, I think, better and better decisions over time. Dopamine, as I've said, is involved in anticipation of wanting, not of having. It's involved in motivation toward the thing that you want, and it biases us towards action. Reward prediction error equals the actual amount of dopamine that's released in response to something versus minus the amount that's expected. Okay. So if you tell a kid, we might have ice cream, they hear, we're going to have ice cream, and they expect it. And if you later say, well, we're not going to have ice cream, and I said maybe, that's actually going to lead to a much bigger crash in dopamine. It's going to lead to a negative signal, a punishment signal. It's literally going to feel like pain. So kids, you can leverage this. If your parents say maybe, they're effectively telling your dopamine system absolutely. Now, adults are like this too. If we think something might happen and it doesn't happen, there's a big crash in our affect, in our emotionality. And that's because that dopamine system goes from firing about 3 to 4 times per second to about 10 or 15 times per second in the possibility that something might happen. Possibility is deeply woven into our biology of the dopamine and motivation system as a way for us, presumably in ancient times, to explore novel territories and get a sense that maybe there's water there, maybe there are mates there, maybe there's better food there, maybe there's resources there. The maybe is an important thing that in language terms, maybe means maybe. But in neurobiological terms, maybe means perhaps there's going to be the surprise of an even bigger dopamine reward. And the one thing dopamine loves more than anything else is surprise. Social media, getting dopamine hit after dopamine hit. When we first get on social media for the first time or after a long period of time, the amount of dopamine that's released we think is quite substantial. It's novel. Remember, dopamine is about novelty, surprise, and the sense that we are on some exciting track. That's what dopamine is really about. It puts us into states of readiness, anticipation, looking, seeking, etc., almost always for things outside the confines of our skin. Just to contrast it maybe for a bit more of a future discussion, serotonin does the opposite. When there's a lot of serotonin in our brain and body, typically it makes us feel satisfied, sated, and more quiescent, comfortable with what we have in our own immediate sphere and within us, right? The comfort of a good meal, the food you have. Dopamine is about go, go, go. If you look at somebody who's high on cocaine or methamphetamine, it's all about pursuit, because that's a very dopaminergic drug. You look at somebody who's taken a drug, and I'm not suggesting people do this, but it really ramps up serotonin. Let's say a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, Prozac, Zoloft, et cetera. The side effects of those drugs, if the dosages are too high, lack of appetite, lack of libido, kind of meh about life, then so they'll adjust the dose down. That's because those are serotonergic drugs. So in general, when we are in pursuit of things, dopamine is quite high. So now you have to remind me your question, because I've set up the dopamine serotonin parallel.
Smartphones.
Cell phones, yes. Forgive me. So the thing about cell phones is when you first get on there and you have, let's say no Wi-Fi on the flight or something, and you land, it can actually be quite stimulating. You get a lot of dopamine. Oh, there's this. Oh, there's that. But very quickly, when you're scrolling on social media, you're no longer getting the novelty, but you're continuing to do it and you almost don't know why you're doing it. At that point, it shifts over to something that's a bit more like an obsessive compulsive behavior, where we can define an obsessive compulsive behavior where the obsession leads to a compulsion. So the obsession is a thought, the compulsion is a behavior, but the acting out of the compulsion merely serves to increase the obsession. Right? This is very different than being obsessed with food or obsessed with cleanliness.
There's no payoff.
Right, exactly. There's no anxiety relief by carrying out the compulsion. With OCD behaviors, like scrolling social media, the dopamine quickly wanes, and then you find that you're just sort of, and we've all been there, you're scrolling, you're like, why am I doing this? This isn't that interesting. This isn't that interesting. Now, the algorithms for social media are very clever, and I don't want to demonize it. I provide a lot of my life is spent on, on social media now, but in the algorithms that they've incorporated function on the most powerful way to keep people doing a behavior, or an animal for that matter, is intermittent random reward, or random intermittent reward, that you don't know when you're going to hit the jackpot. So you're scrolling, and then you see something. Typically, it's very high, what, in nerd speak, we'd say signal to noise. So if you're reading some interesting things, this came out in the news, and then it's all of a sudden a riot, or a person that is base jumping off a building, or, for people that are scrolling, looking at bodies or something like that, live bodies. Hopefully people aren't looking at the dead bodies. But look, if something's very tragic, then that has this gravitational pull. And then what happens is you start getting the system working for that next dopamine hit that you don't know when it's going to come. It's just like gambling. So I look at social media as initially being very dopaminergic, driving reward, surprise, and excitement, but very quickly transitioning to something more like OCD. And the kinds of behaviors where it looks, if we were to look at ourselves through the lens of an experiment, like we would an animal experiment, we think that animal is sick. If you saw an animal digging in the corner, looking for a bone, the dog is looking, you'd think that's really sad. That's us, right? That's us. I'm pointing at myself intentionally. That's us. So we have to learn to self-regulate the amount of time, but that doesn't have to be a process of, scruffing ourselves and saying, don't do it. Think about it in terms of the positive. The more time away from something, the more positively reinforcing it will be when you return. There are behavioral tools that you can use to enhance focus. Things like staring at a particular visual target at the same distance at which you're going to perform some work, and doing that for 30 to 60 seconds, narrowing in a very deliberate way your visual field, and then moving into a focused work bout. That behavioral practice of narrowing your visual aperture will increase the amount of acetylcholine transmission in particular neural circuits that will then make it easier to focus. How do we know that? Well, I covered in that episode some of the peer-reviewed studies that relate to protocols that are now actively being deployed in schools in China and elsewhere, where kids are doing deliberate visual focus exercises in order to increase their mental focus. And while they're not doing microdialysis or brain imaging on those kids in real time, the cognitive effects and indeed the performance effects in terms of academic ability and output are pretty impressive. So acetylcholine increases focus. We talked about some dietary and some supplementation-based ways to improve acetylcholine, or I should say increase acetylcholine. And that does in fact lead to increases in one's ability to focus. This is why a lot of the prescription drugs for the treatment of Alzheimer's, age-related cognitive decline, and indeed even some of the drugs that tap into treatments for ADHD also involve the acetylcholine system. So there's nothing surprising or heretical here, but it is important to point out that your behavioral ability to focus is also related to your ability to access and deploy acetylcholine. So never do we want purely pharmacologic treatments to be the only way that people are increasing a given neuromodulator. I always say behaviors first, then nutrition, then supplementation, and then if there's a need, certainly a clinical need, then prescription drugs, et cetera, of course, administered through a physician. And nowadays, there's a ton of interest in social media and in video games. And there have been some measurements of the amount of dopamine released. Video games, especially video games that have a very high update speed, where there's novel territory all the time, novelty is a big stimulus of dopamine. Those can release dopamine somewhere between nicotine and cocaine. So very high levels of dopamine release. Social media is an interesting one because the amount of dopamine that's released in response to logging onto social media initially could be quite high, but it seems likely that there's a taper in the amount of dopamine, and yet people still get addicted. So why? Why is it that we can get addicted to things that fail to elicit the same massive amount of pleasure that they initially did? Being addicted to something isn't just about the fact that it feels so good that you want to do it over and over again. And that's because of this pleasure-pain balance that underlies motivation. So let's look a little bit closer at the pleasure-pain balance, because therein lies the tools for you to be able to control motivation toward healthy things and avoid motivated behaviors towards things that are destructive for you. There are a lot of reasons why people try novel behaviors, whether or not those are drugs or whether or not those are adventure, thrill-seeking things, or they seek out new partners, or, they take a new class. As you'll notice, I'm not placing any judgment or value on these different behaviors. Although I think it's fair to point out that for most people, addictive drugs like cocaine and amphetamine are very destructive. Actually, we know that about 15 to 20% of people have a genetic bias towards addiction that, you sometimes hear that the first time that you use a drug, you can become addicted to it. That's actually not been shown to be true for most things and most people, but for some people that actually is true. And we'll talk a little bit later about why certain people are heavily biased toward becoming addicts on the first use of a particular drug. It's actually very interesting. It has everything to do with whether or not they were formerly addicted to something else. But in any case, the way that addiction works and the way that motivation works generally in the non-addictive setting is that when you anticipate something, a little bit of dopamine is released. And then when you reach that thing, you engage in that thing, the amount of dopamine goes up even further. But as you repeatedly pursue a behavior and you repeatedly engage with a particular thing, let's say you love running or you love chocolate. As you eat a piece of chocolate, believe it or not, it tastes good. And then there's a shift away from activation of dopamine, and there are other chemicals that are released that trigger a low-level sense of pain. Now, you might not feel it as physical pain, but the craving that you feel is both one part dopamine and one part the mirror image of dopamine, which is the pain or the craving for yet another piece of chocolate. And this is a very important and subtle feature of the dopamine system that's not often discussed. People always talk about just as pleasure. You love social media, so it gives you dopamine, and so you engage in that. You like chocolate, it releases dopamine, so you do that. But for every bit of dopamine that's released, there's another circuit in the brain that creates, you can think of it as kind of like a downward deflection in pleasure. So you engage in something you really want, and there's an increase in pleasure. And then there's without you doing anything, there's a mirror image of that, which is a downward deflection in pleasure, which we're calling pain. So for every bit of pleasure, there is a mirror image experience of pain, and they overlap in time very closely. So it's sometimes hard to sense this, but try it. The next time you eat something really delicious, you'll take a bite. It tastes delicious. And part of the experience is to want more of that thing. This is true for any pleasureful experience. Now, the diabolical part about dopamine is that because it didn't evolve in order to get you to indulge in more and more and more of something, what happens is that initially you experience an increase in pleasure, and you also experience this increase in pain shortly after or woven in with the pleasure that makes you want more of that thing. But with each subsequent time that you encounter that thing, that you pursue the chocolate, that you pursue the lover, each time the experience of dopamine release and pleasure is diminished a little bit. And the diabolical thing is that the pain response is increased a little bit. And this is best observed in the context of drug-seeking behavior. The first time someone decides to take cocaine or amphetamine, they may do it out of boredom. They may do it out of peer pressure. They may do it to relieve some internal sense. Maybe they're bored or they're just excited. Maybe they're high in novelty seeking. There are a lot of reasons why people might try a drug. Far too many for us to get into or parse here. Maybe they don't even want to do it, but someone encourages them. They will experience a huge dopamine release and they will feel likely very good. However, the next time they take it, it won't feel quite as good. And it won't feel even as good the third time or the next time. But the amount of pain, the amount of craving that they experience for the drug will increase over time. So much of our pursuit of pleasure is simply to reduce the pain of craving. So the next time you experience something you really like, I don't want to take you out of that experience, but it's really important that you notice this, that if there's something you really enjoy, part of that enjoyment is about the anticipation and wanting of more of that thing. And that's the pain system in action. Learning to cultivate a life of focus, and I should say it should be the way to support that is to have components of your day of wordlessness and defocus. I do want to emphasize that because it's not about waking up and from morning till night being ultra focused, right? I don't do the make my bed first thing. I admit it. I sometimes like it happens midday. Okay. All right. I wouldn't make it in the military, but we knew that already anyway. So it's about being in recognition of where you're at and focused and dropping in deeply for certain portions of the day. But I also have a deliberate decompress time of my day, right? I take 30 minutes a day and I either take a nap or I do a yoga nidra or I just let my mind go. But that does mean not mindless scrolling, although I do some mindless scrolling too. I allow myself that. But having periods of the day where you let the mind defocus and just kind of drift in the same way that your mind drifts a bit during sleep, that is what allows you to focus. So it very intensely afterward or on a consistent basis. So it's not about being a total animal from morning till night and then just expecting to switch off the thinking and go right to sleep. It's about, for me, there are really two 90-minute blocks, one early in the day and one later in the day where I commit to doing really focused work twice a day. And I have to fight tooth and nail to create the space for those and to make sure it happens. And I fail a lot, if something gets in the way and I don't do that, I just try and get back on track as quickly as possible. I don't bring my phone. I put my phone on airplane mode when I'm training and doing any kind of physical work now because it's just too distracting. People form these associations, whether or not through experience or through indirect experience, observing others. I think public speaking is one of the greatest. Fear of dying. It's funny. It's not funny, but figure of speech. I never think about dying and being afraid of dying. I think about all the scary things that could happen while I'm living. But there are many people who are just intrinsically afraid of dying. And so that's a big one. For people that don't swim, fear of drowning. For people that swim, less so. For people that have some sort of psychiatric disorder, genuine psychiatric disorder, like obsessive compulsive disorder, which is not just obsessive compulsive personality, but obsessive compulsive disorder, fear of being discovered and the shame that they have around their obsessions and compulsions. These are true OCD is very common.
Do they all live in the same place? All of these different fears that are all existing in the same place? So I was rattling off and I didn't answer your question to the more important point, so forgive me. The short answer is they have a final common pathway, which is increased autonomic arousal, and that is funneled through a couple what we call limbic structures, among others. So there's certainly involvement of the now famous amygdala, which means almond, is this almond-shaped structure on the two sides of the brain. There's also an area of the brain called the stria terminalis that's also involved in fear. And then the hypothalamus, this small collection of neurons just above the roof of your mouth, which is really, to me, one of the more fascinating areas of the brain, harbors neurons that create a body-wide and brain-wide response to something that the higher order areas of the brain, like the forebrain, see and perceive as dangerous, as threatening. So the short answer is yes, it all funnels through hypothalamus, amygdala, stria terminalis, and autonomic nervous system. That's a final common pathway. But in terms of the variety of different things that can stimulate fear and the ways that they can do that, that is highly contextual. So the forebrain, this real estate in the brain right behind the forehead, is incredible because it's sort of free real estate for you to customize for your life, according to what happens to you early on. So for instance, you might not be at all afraid of heights. And you say, well, why is that so? Well, maybe when you were a kid, you were one of those maniacs that liked, doing, in the States, we call them cherry drops, the kids that could, swing on their feet and then jump off the bar. And then other kids are timidly crawling to the top of the thing, don't even want to go up the ladder to the slide. There's a ton of variation, and that variation does not exist in the kind of deeper circuitry, the final common path circuitry. It exists in the learning that we experienced early in life. One bad fall,
can do it. I mean, I was bitten very badly by a German Shepherd when I was a kid. Head almost got my eye, but for whatever reason, I've always liked dogs anyway. But there are other things that I've experienced that have left long-term negative imprints. So it's highly contextual, and a lot of it has to do with what happens immediately after the bad experience. This is why nowadays there's a lot of legal use of the drug ketamine after traumas. This is all very dark stuff, unfortunately. But if you just imagine the family member that was just in a car crash and saw the driver, their loved one, impaled onto the steering column. I mean, what could be more horrible than that? Nowadays, if they come into the emergency room, they will often give them an injection of ketamine, which is a dissociative anesthetic, to get them to dissociate from this extreme emotional state. So there are ways now to treat this, and ketamine is used clinically at later periods too. People that are always in anticipation and desire and seeking, that's wonderful for pursuing goals. However, it's terrible for enjoying life. And actually, those people are actually quite difficult to be around. There's a certain almost sociopathic element to people who are what they call hyperdopaminergic, people who are always on the dopaminergic scale, to the point where they are always pursuing goals. In fact, those people are known to be, at least in the psychological spectrum, they can be very manipulative. Dopamine and the pursuit of something doesn't necessarily have to be high energy and intense from the outside when you observe it from the outside. In fact, there are people who will manipulate in order to get what they want. This has been shown, who have high levels of dopamine release in their brain, but they've learned that a kind of passive manipulation is the best way to maneuver through a particular environment. Now, I don't want to focus too much on sociopathy, because those are kind of extreme examples. But it just goes to show that people who identify a goal and realize the series of steps that they need to take in order to achieve that goal can either do it through ethical means or non-ethical means. They can do it through active pursuit, being the kind of type A person that's always declaring their goals and going after it, posting it on Instagram, telling everybody about it, trying to recruit others. There's that phenotype. There's that kind of signature of dopamine. And then there are the people that want to get what they want, and they're doing it by always serving other people, by always taking care of everybody else's needs, by always trying to accomplish their goals, but through a mode that, at least from the outside, seems more passive or more about supporting others. Neither of these are good or bad, and that's because dopamine is a molecule. It doesn't care how you reach your goals. It only cares that you reach your goals, because the internal sensation is one, again, of mild pleasure, a little bit of pain, although more pain over time if you're not reaching those goals, and it takes you away from the here and now. The question is how to get enough sleep and how to make sure you get into all these different sleep states. And this is particularly important for you so-called night owls. There's a lot of controversy out there as to whether or not different so-called chronotypes exist. That is, people who just naturally or genetically want to be an early bird, wake up early and go to bed early. So these people that wake up at 4 a.m. and would be most comfortable going to bed by 7 or 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. Then there are so-called night owls, people that would feel best or tend to feel best when they go to sleep at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., even 3 a.m., and like to wake up later, 8, 9, 10, or even 11 a.m. or noon. And then, of course, most people go to sleep somewhere between 10 p.m. and midnight and wake up somewhere between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m., or I suppose more typically 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. Now, whether or not real chronotypes exist or whether or not people simply select schedules for sleep and wakefulness that they like because of their social schedules or the activities they enjoy. For instance, some people like to really go out. They like to go out dancing or hear music or spend time in venues that are only open late at night and don't even open until noon or after. Other people, like myself, rarely go out at night, but I like to get up early. I like to exercise. I like to see the sunrise, etc. So I don't know if I'm a morning person or an evening person. I just know the things I enjoy tend to happen in the early part of the day, and the things that I don't enjoy quite as much tend to happen late at night. Regardless of whether or not there are real genetic propensities to be a night owl or an early bird or a sort of typical person right there in the middle, it's very important that people have some control over their sleep schedule. And even more important, that people are able to get sufficient amount of REM sleep and slow wave sleep for many reasons, but including the reasons I discussed in the previous study related to metabolism. I'm very excited, therefore, about a study that came out in Sleep Medicine. This was a few years ago, but somehow I missed this one. It was published in 2019. And the title of this article is Resetting the Late Timing of Night Owls Has a Positive Impact on Mental Health, Physical Health, and Performance. This is a study done in humans, focusing specifically on people that like to stay up late and sleep in, but who desire to be able to get up and feel alert in order to go to work or study, and they want to go to sleep a bit earlier. And so there are a lot of questions embedded in this study, in particular whether or not people can actually shift their schedule by a few hours or more. Some people out there contend that if you're a night owl, that's just going to be impossible or very, very challenging to do. Turns out it's not impossible, and it's not even that challenging to do, provided you do the right things. Just a brief overview of the study, and then I'll give you the key takeaways. It was a randomized controlled trial. It involved a number of different people, both male and female. And what they did was they used non-pharmacological, practical interventions in a real-world setting. Here I'm paraphrasing. They used targeted light exposure. They used consistent sleep-wake times. They used fixed meal times, caffeine intake, and exercise. And this is one of the reasons I love this study so much, because I've done episodes where I've talked about temperature, exercise, feeding, and most importantly, light exposure as a way to control and shift your sleep-wake cycles, your so-called circadian timing and entrainment. What did they find? Well, they found, quote, significant improvements in terms of mood, so far less depression and stress, subjectively measured, as well as improved cognitive performance that was objectively measured, so improved reaction times, improved physical grip strength, which is actually a measure not just of strength per se, but also of nervous system function, and a number of things that people could do in order to optimize their morning hours, even though they were night owls previously. What did they have people do? Well, I'm just going to list this off in sort of rapid fire succession. Then we'll provide a link to the study if you want to learn more. First of all, they told participants to try and wake up 2 to 3 hours before their typical wake up time. 2 to 3 hours. That seems brutal to me, and probably seems brutal to you if you're somebody who typically wakes up at 10 a.m. to try and get up at 8 or even 7 a.m. consistently. But they were also asked to maximize outdoor light exposure during the mornings for reasons that if you've listened to this podcast before, if you've heard me talk about before, you know that I'm constantly talking about. I'll probably go into the grave shouting, please get as much light exposure from sunlight early in the day as possible, because it sets in motion a huge number of things that are beneficial for your mental health and physical health, including dopamine production, timing melatonin production correctly, reducing cortisol peaks late in the day, et cetera, et cetera. So they asked them to get a lot of outdoor light exposure. They didn't give them a specific amount, but they said maximize outdoor light exposure during the mornings, the time before noon. And again, they had them waking up 2 to 3 hours before their habitual wake-up time. They were also told, and this is very important if you're going to shift your schedule earlier, to try and keep sleep-wake times fixed between their work days and their weekends. So not sleeping in on the weekends or not having any sleep-in days, regardless of how well they slept the night before. How fixed? Within 15 to 30 minutes of their pre-designated time. So if they were waking up at 7 o'clock one day, they set their alarm and they made sure they got out of bed at 7 o'clock every day, plus or minus 30 minutes, but never later than 7:30, never earlier than 6:30. Participants were also asked to try and go to sleep 2 to 3 hours before their habitual bedtime. So again, these are people that want to stay up late, like 11 p.m. perhaps, but even as late as 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. And now they are asked to go to sleep 2 to 3 hours before their habitual bedtime and to wake up 2 to 3 hours earlier, as I mentioned earlier. They were also told, and I love this because it fits with many of the things we've talked about on this podcast before, to try and limit light exposure during the evenings. Dim the lights or limit altogether artificial lights. A lot of reasons for that. I covered that in the Master Sleep episode. I covered that in the Optimize Health Using Light episode. You can find those at hubermanlab.com. They're asking them to do that here. And they ask participants to keep a regular schedule for their daily meals, not eating on the hour consistently, at 9 a.m., noon, 3 p.m. exactly, but within, again, about 15 to 30 minutes, they're always eating at the same times. That was also important. And again, that's because we have these so-called food-entrained circadian clocks. When you eat, tells your body when to be alert, and when you're not eating, when to be asleep. And they were told to not drink any caffeine after 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Another theme that we've talked about on this podcast. They were also told not to take naps after 4 p.m. Naps are an interesting feature of the sleep-wake cycle. To be very brief about this and to pull from the episode that I did with world sleep expert from University of California, Berkeley, Matt Walker, naps are great for many people, but don't nap if it interferes with your nighttime sleep. And in this study, they told them, don't nap after 4 p.m. And if you are a napper, don't nap for more than 90 minutes. 10-minute naps are fine, 20-minute naps are fine, 0-minute naps are fine, but don't nap for more than 90 minutes and don't nap after 4 p.m. And to exercise during the morning. Now, this one can be a bit controversial because I know a lot of the PTs out there and a lot of the online, gym rats and people and runners too, for that matter, will say, well, according to body temperature and research, it's best to exercise in the afternoon. Look, it's better to exercise sometime as opposed to no time. But if you're focused on how to shift your schedule earlier, meaning get up earlier and go to sleep earlier, this study had people exercise in the early part of the day, certainly before 2 p.m. and ideally before noon. So again, this is a really important study because it combines a lot of different variables to arrive at this very impressive shift where people can get up 2 to 3 hours earlier and then pretty consistently and reflexively start going to bed 2 to 3 hours earlier, feeling more alert during the day. Again, improvements in cognitive performance, mood, and physical performance, grip strength, etc. Very few studies are able to or are willing to tackle so many variables and combine them in one study. This paper, I think, does a marvelous job of doing this and is incorporating things that individually each have some support for them in animal studies and previous human studies. But as far as I know, this is one of the few studies that really combines all these different features in one place. Eating times, keeping those consistent, getting maximal sunlight exposure earlier in the day, getting up at a consistent time, going to sleep at a consistent time, and on and on. It's a really marvelous study for that reason. And I think for any of you that are night owls and any of you that want to reinforce your early waking and early to bed times, and I think for most all of you who fall into that general middle category of tend to go to sleep somewhere between 10 p.m. and midnight, because that's most people, and tend to wake up sometime between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m., well, maybe you want to become more of an early riser, or maybe you're going to travel, or the seasons are changing and you want to shift your time, or you have a new job, etc. Or something that's actually very common in terms of relationship struggle. You want to match your wake sleep times, or maybe you want to offset your wake sleep times from a significant other. These sorts of approaches that I described here and that are supported by the data in this paper are absolutely powerful and science supported. And I'm certain that if you were to apply them, that you would see essentially the same effects that were observed here. If we are in a pretty relaxed state, or if we are happy, we generally feel like we can do what we want to do. We can maneuver through our environment. We can make choices that are reasonable, but oftentimes we're not in relaxed and happy states. That's just part of the human experience, obviously. And there's a fundamental feature to the nervous system, which is this thing they call the autonomic nervous system, which is just fancy nerd speak for the components of your nervous system that raise your levels of alertness or bring them way down. Sometimes we hear fight or flight, rest and digest, but this system governs all that, but a lot more. And basically what happens is when we are at the extremes of the autonomic, what I call seesaw, of very, very alert to the point of being really stressed or panicked or concerned, or if we are very close to sleep and we're drowsy and we're exhausted, at those points along the autonomic nervous system, our thoughts become a bit like a runaway train. You know, if you're very upset, it's hard to talk yourself out of it. If you're stressed, it's hard to think yourself out of it. In fact, you can start doing all sorts of third personing and rationalization. You can call someone, you can text somebody. It's very hard to get yourself out of those states with thinking alone. But the beauty of the autonomic nervous system is that it traverses the brain and the body, and it connects to essentially all the organs of the body. And it's a two-way street, such that certain behaviors, even certain patterns of breathing, etc., allow us to shift where we are on the autonomic continuum between very, very alert and stressed and very calm, and thereby give our mind a shift also in terms of the kinds of thoughts that we can entertain, the sorts of actions that we can engage in. To make this concrete, if you're very, very stressed, you're very, very upset, two things happen. One, it's very hard to take your focus off whatever it is that's upsetting you. And if you don't know what's upsetting you, pure anxiety, but you don't know why, it's very hard to take your mind off of the feelings of anxiety. In those states of mind, there's another component, which is that for whatever reason, and no one really understands why this is, it feels as if the state that you're in will go on forever. Now, when we're in happy, relaxed states, rarely do we think, gosh, this is going to go on forever. And yet when we are in these unfortunate states of mind, we get the idea somehow, it sort of hijacks our perception of time, and we feel like this is never going to stop. If we turn to the body and certain behaviors, we talk about what those are, we are able to move ourselves along the autonomic continuum. And at that point, when we've done that successfully, and it's actually quite straightforward to do, we are able to think about things differently. We start to get a sense that the way we feel might not be the way we're going to feel forever. And it's in those shifts that we start to realize, my mind actually is not my best friend at these extremes, but there's a lot more to it. You're only getting the tip of the iceberg in those states. So that's why I say, if you can't control the mind with the mind, look to the body to control the mind. When you deprive a kid of something that is very, very dopaminergic, that stimulates the release of a lot of dopamine, and then they actually have access to that at a friend's house or something of that sort, it is going to create a massive increase in pleasure. So I think there's this issue of, not eliminating things, but having a controlled relationship to these very, very powerful stimuli. I mean, movies are very powerful. This is not the topic that we're talking about right now, but I get a lot of questions these days about dopamine and about pornography, for instance. Pornography, removing all judgment from this, because that's not what the basis of the conversation is. Pornography has created an enormous number of problems in certain countries in the last 10 years, mostly because of its immense availability and the intensity of the images. It's also wired up a lot of young brains to become aroused watching other people have sex as opposed to being in the physical act of sex themselves. So there's a lot of, you can't even call it third personing, and they're not, they're aroused by imagery that they're not actually participating in. And I get a lot of questions about this, especially from the younger audience. So, am I saying all pornography is bad? No, not necessarily. I don't know. Any discussion about sex and sexuality, I always say we're of course framing it in the context of age appropriate, consensual, context appropriate, species appropriate. But the point is that, anything that stimulates a lot of dopamine release is a very sharp blade. So if you eliminate it completely, great in the short term, potentially treacherous in the long term. That kid goes to a friend's house and sees, a movie. Let's just remove pornography from the conversation.
Or get a bag of cookies.
Yeah, a bag of cookies. Suddenly it tastes candy for the first time, and the brain is hardwired to get very, very excited about that. So then now you're dealing with a kid that potentially could get even more addicted to these things. So it just has to be controlled. It has to be controlled. Any potent stimulus, highly processed, highly palatable food, visual imagery, movies, has to be controlled. If we were to draw a line between the obsessions and the compulsions, that line could be described as anxiety. Now, we need to define what anxiety is. And to be quite honest, most of psychology and science can't agree on exactly what anxiety is. Typically, the way we think about fear is that it's a heightened state of autonomic arousal, so increased heart rate, increased breathing, sweating, etc., in response to an immediate and present threat or perceived threat. Whereas anxiety, generally speaking in the scientific literature, relates to the same sorts of thought patterns and somatic bodily responses, heart rate, breathing, etc., but without a clear and present danger being in the environment or right there. So that's the way that we're going to talk about anxiety now. And anxiety is really what binds the obsessions and compulsions, such that someone will have an intrusive thought. So for instance, someone will have the thought that if they turn left on any street, that something bad will happen. Okay, that's an obsession. It's actually not all that uncommon. Now, how bad and what the specificity of that bad thing really is will vary. Some people will think if I turn left, something generally bad will happen. It just makes me feel anxious, so they always insist on going right. Whereas other people will think if I turn left, so-and-so will die, or I will die, or something terrible will happen. I'll get a disease, or someone else will get a disease, or I'll be cursing myself or somebody else in some very specific way. This is unfortunately quite common in people with OCD. So they have this feeling, and the feeling can be generally or specifically related to a particular outcome. But beneath that is a feeling of anxiety, a quickening of the heartbeat, a quickening of breathing, a narrowing of one's visual focus. I've talked about this before on other podcasts, the Master Stress and other podcasts, but if you haven't heard those, let me just briefly describe that when we are in a state of increased so-called autonomic arousal, alertness, stress, etc., our visual field literally narrows. The aperture of our visual field gets smaller, and that's because of the relationship between the autonomic nervous system and your visual system. So you start seeing the world through sort of soda straw view or through binocular-like view as opposed to seeing the big picture. Why is that important? Well, it literally sharpens and narrows your focus toward the very thing that the obsessions and the compulsions are focused on. So the person walking down the street who sees the opportunity to go left or right will only see the bad decision. Their visual field narrows very tightly along that possibility of taking a left turn. And I know as I describe this, it seems totally irrational, but I want to emphasize that the person with OCD knows it's irrational. They might feel crazy because they're having these thoughts, but they know it makes no sense whatsoever that left somehow would be different than right in terms of outcomes in this particular case. And yet it feels as if it would. In fact, in some cases, it feels as if they went left, they would have a full-blown panic attack. So the idea here is that the obsessions and compulsions are bound by anxiety, but then by taking a right-hand turn, again, in this one particular example, by taking a right-hand turn, there's a very brief, I should mention, very brief relief of that anxiety at the time of the decision to go right, not left. And there's an additional drop in anxiety while one takes the right-hand turn as opposed to the left-hand turn. And then, as I alluded to before, there's a reinforcement of the compulsion. In other words, by going right, it doesn't create a situation in the brain and psychology of the person that, you know what, I'm not anxious anymore. Left would have probably been okay. It reinforces the idea that right made me feel better, or turning right made me feel better, and going left would have been that much worse. Again, it reinforces the obsession even further. And again, we could swap out right turns and left turns with something like hand washing, the feeling that something is contaminated and the need to wash one's hands, even though one already washed their hands 20, 30, 50 times prior. And we're actually going to go back to that example a little bit later when we talk about one particular category of therapies that are very effective in many people for OCD, which are the cognitive behavioral and exposure therapies. Because I think some of you have heard of cognitive behavioral and exposure therapies, but the way they are used to treat OCD is very much different than the way they're used to treat other sorts of anxiety disorders and other sorts of disorders generally. So it's fair to say that up to 70% of people with OCD have some sort of anxiety or elevated anxiety, either directly related to the OCD or indirectly related to the OCD. And it's really hard to tease those apart because OCD can create its own anxiety. As I mentioned before, it can even increase its own anxiety. And there's also an issue of depression. Having OCD can be very depressing, right? Especially if some of these OCD thoughts and behaviors start to really impede people's ability to function in life, at work and school and relationship. They can start feeling less optimistic about life. And in fact, some people can become suicidally depressed. That's how bad OCD can be for us. So we have to be careful when saying that 70% of people with OCD also have anxiety, or X number of people with OCD are also depressed, because we don't know whether or not the depression led the OCD or the other way around, or whether or not they're operating, as we say in science, in parallel. Some of the drug treatments for OCD and depression and anxiety can tease some of that apart, and we'll talk about that. But I think it's fair to say that what binds the obsessions and compulsions is anxiety, that there's a feeling of it, or I should say an urgent feeling of a need to get rid of the obsession, and the person feels as if the only way they can do that is to engage in a particular compulsive behavior. When we lack social interaction that we expect, we become prosocial. However, if we are chronically socially isolated, meaning we don't have interactions with people for a long time, we become actually more introverted. This is separate from all of the tachykinin stuff that I talked about earlier, or falling into states of chronic stress. But it's well established now that in humans and in animals, if you don't give them enough social interaction, they actually become antisocial. And so this is actually a little bit like what one might see with long-term fasting. Okay, I give the example of eating every 4 hours. Now let's give the parallel example of somebody who's been fasting perhaps for 2 or 3 days. If they are expecting to eat and then the meal doesn't arrive, they are not necessarily going to immediately try and seek out food. And that's a little bit counterintuitive. You would have thought, well, they haven't eaten in a very long time. They're going to be very motivated to seek out food. But no, they are accustomed to fasting. Similarly, this social homeostasis circuit works in a way such that when we don't have social interactions for a very long time, we start to lose our craving for social interactions. If you give people a little bit of an understanding of the underlying mechanisms, it creates a system around any tool that makes it easier to do that practice and makes it more impactful as well. So what I mean is, I could do a whole episode just listing off tools and protocols for everything from fat loss to focus and attention, mental health, depression, trauma, grief, et cetera, based on the data. But if I start each episode, which I do, with a little bit of a description of the mechanism, for instance, how cold impacts metabolism, how, for instance, a particular childhood attachment pattern to a parent translates to an adult romantic attachment pattern. Then when I go into some of the description about the tools, my hope is that people will have those mechanisms in mind, or even just subconsciously they're embedded. And then not only are they going to be more willing to lean into those tools, but those tools will be more impactful. And the last thing I'll say about this is I have a colleague at Stanford. I should introduce you guys because she'd make a phenomenal podcast guest. Her name is Aaliyah Crum. She is a tenured professor at Stanford. She's a trained clinical psychologist. She was a Division I gymnast, and she's a martial artist. And she works on beliefs and belief systems. And she has incredible data showing that the result of anything you do or what you eat is both the consequence of that thing. So like she's done experiments, for instance, where they give people milkshakes and they tell them, okay, this is a low calorie milkshake. Or they tell people this is a high calorie, nutrient dense.
And it's a regular milkshake.
It's a milkshake. People drink that and they measure subjective reports of how fulfilling that and how much satiety, how much satisfaction it provides and for how long. And they measure hormones, insulin, ghrelin, all the hormones that are the consequence of eating. And what you find is that what they find is that if people are told this is a high calorie, nutrient dense shake, it provides much more satisfaction for much longer than if they're told that it's a low calorie, nutrient sparse shake. And the hormones that one secretes in response to that milkshake differ in the two groups, even though the milkshakes are absolutely identical.
Because it's all about your beliefs.
It's in part about your beliefs. Because of course, if, you can't tell yourself that the entire chocolate cake is, just a bowl of broccoli, and it's going to have the same effects as a bowl of broccoli. So anything you do, whether or not it's exercise, cold bath, what you consume is the consequence of that thing. There are some undeniable, non-negotiable realities about your biology. And then there's the belief system. And the other example I'll give is they've done these beautiful studies where they tell one group, listen, stress is a part of life and it gives you dementia. It makes your thinking suffer. It can kill neurons. It can do all this terrible stuff. They tell another group, all that's true, by the way, in certain contexts. They tell another group, stress is a part of life, but it can sharpen your thinking. It can bring out your best. It can stimulate your immune system as long as it doesn't last too long. And what they find is that the biological effects of stress on those two groups match what those people are taught about stress.
Wow.
And so you can't get around the realities of stress or calories or things of that sort. There's the laws of physics and the laws of biology, but belief systems have a powerful role in how the tools and practices that we engage in shape us. And so that's the logical backbone for teaching people a bit about the mechanism. Because if I say, hey, do an ice bath, it increases your metabolism, increases your resilience, and can reduce pain and inflammation, help you sleep better at night, great. But lots of people are saying that. But if I say, listen, there's this pathway where when you get into cold water and it's really uncomfortable and you really want to get out, but you stay in for an extra minute, you stimulate this certain adrenaline-related pathway in your brain and body. Now, when you do it and you hit that wall, you're like, I really want to get out of here. You think, no, I want to stimulate that pathway. And then your belief and understanding about that pathway really does shape the fact that it works. And so teaching mechanism is in part for me about educating and turning people on to the beauty of biology. But I realize, look, not everyone wants to be a biologist or a researcher, but I think everybody wants better mental health, physical health, and performance. And so mechanism has a real impact. Next, I'd like to talk about some of the research on and the roles of hormones in OCD, because it turns out to be a very interesting relationship there. But before I do, I want to point out something that I realize I probably should have said earlier, which is one of the key things for someone with OCD to come to understand if they're going to experience any relief of their symptoms, whether or not they're doing drug treatments or behavioral treatments or otherwise, is that thoughts are not as bad as actions, right? Thoughts are not as bad as actions. One of the kind of rules that people with OCD seem to adopt for themselves is that thoughts are really, truly the equivalent of actions. So they'll have an intrusive thought, and we haven't spent too much time on this today, but earlier I touched on the fact that some of the intrusive thoughts that people have in OCD are really disturbing. They can be really gross, or at least gross to that person. They can evoke imagery that is, toxic or infectious, or is highly sexualized in a way that is disturbing to them, can be very taboo. This is not uncommon when you start talking to people with OCD and you start kind of pulling on the thread. Again, this would be a psychiatrist who was trained to ask the right questions and gain the comfort and trust of a patient. They start to reveal that these thoughts are really intrusive and kind of disturbing, which is why they feel so compelled to try and suppress them with behaviors. One of the powerful elements of treatment for OCD is to really support the patient and make them realize that thoughts are just thoughts, and that everyone has disturbing thoughts, and that oftentimes those disturbing thoughts arise at the most inconvenient and sometimes what seems like the most inappropriate circumstances. And this relates to a whole larger discussion that we could have about what are thoughts and why do they surface, and how come when you stand at the edge of a bridge, even if you do not want to jump off, you think about jumping off. And, this has to do with the fact that your nervous system as a prediction machine is oftentimes testing possibilities. And sometimes that testing goes way off into the netherlands of the thought patterns and emotional patterns that we all have inside of us. The big difference between a thought and an action is that, of course, the nervous system is, in one case, not translating those patterns of thinking into motor sequences. That nerdy way of saying thoughts aren't actions, believe it or not, can be helpful for people if they really think about that and use it as an opportunity to realize that, first of all, they're not crazy. They're not thinking and feeling this stuff because they're bad or evil. And of course, sometimes this can cross over with other elements of life where we place moral judgment on people for certain behaviors. I think that's part of a healthy society, of course. That's why we have laws and punishments and rewards, for that matter, for certain types of behaviors. But this idea that thoughts are not as bad as actions, and that thoughts can be tolerated, and the anxiety around thoughts can be tolerated and over time can diminish, that's a very powerful hallmark theme of the treatment of OCD. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. Thoughts are not actions. Actions can harm us. They can harm other people. They can soak up enormous amounts of time. Thoughts can soak up enormous amounts of time. They can be very troubling. They can be very detrimental. We, of course, want to be sensitive to that. But when it really comes down to it, the first step in treatment for OCD is this realization, or the approach to the realization that thoughts are not as bad as actions. People vary in the extent to which they feel or have the capacity to feel bonded to anyone. And it is now generally understood that some of that variation might depend on variations in oxytocin receptors, or what are called gene polymorphisms for oxytocin. Genes can have a number of different sequences in them. They're nucleotide sequences. We won't go into genetics right now. A's and G's and C's and T's in various combinations are what make up the genes. Genes are transcribed into RNA. RNA is translated into proteins that affect cells, okay? The oxytocin gene encodes for oxytocin, and variants in that gene change the amount and function of oxytocin. There's a really interesting study published just this last year in a relatively new journal. The journal has a kind of an unusual name. It's Helion. I think it's Helion and not Helion, but Helion, Heliyon. This is a Cell Press journal. As far as I can tell, it's a very solid journal. Certainly the Cell Press label is very stringent. And this paper is entitled The Relation Between Oxytocin Receptor Gene Polymorphisms, which just means changes in genes or variations in genes, adult attachment, and Instagram sociability, an exploratory analysis. This is a really wild study, but I like the study. It's very thorough. First author, last name Carollo, Carollo. And what they found was that by analyzing the genetics of different individuals who are on social media and looking at how many people those individuals follow and how many people follow them, and what they come up with is a so-called social desirability index, they were able to correlate in a very straightforward way that people that carry certain variants in the oxytocin and oxytocin receptor genes actually seek out more online social Instagram interactions. So some people I know, I won't name their names, only follow, anywhere from 0 to 6 accounts. Other people follow thousands of accounts. And they take the ratio of how many accounts people follow versus how many followers they have. Arguably not a perfect measure, but a nice one in the sense that you can do this in a completely unbiased way with many, many thousands of subjects. And then they were able to get genomic analysis from a number of these subjects. And it turns out that people who have, let's say, higher levels of oxytocin function or potential levels of oxytocin function actively seek out more social interactions on social media. So this, I think, represents an important first in the area of how social media and data from social media are starting to merge with biological data in terms of predicting how avidly people will seek out social interactions of an online type. And nowadays we hear a lot about how online we are connected, but we're not really we're communicating, but we're not connected, or the connections aren't real. I think we're going to need to revisit that. While I'm certainly a believer in the idea that face-to-face communication and common interactions with people standing in the same space or playing sports together, enjoying music together, enjoying meals together is vitally important, there's an entire generation or several generations of people that are coming up who much of their social interaction has been online. And if you think about it, all of the things that we've spelled out earlier about common mental narrative, this left brain system a la Alan Shore, or autonomic bonding, or synchronization of heartbeats according to common stories, all that is happening in online social interactions. When 1,000 of us look at the exact same Instagram post, yes, we will have 1,000 independent responses to that, but chances are many of us have a similar or same response based on the data that we talked about earlier in synchronization of heartbeats. And so we are socially bonded with other people through social media, and it's very apparent that the oxytocin system is playing some role in that. And this, if we zoom out, makes perfect sense because, again, dopamine, serotonin, prolactin, oxytocin, none of these systems were placed in us or are organized within us in order to encourage specific and only specific types of social interactions. The one that we can say is absolutely critical is the child-parent interaction, right? Because children simply can't take care of themselves. They need a caretaker. I should have said caretaker, not parent. But infants, if they're not taken care of, will die. But beyond that, we have evolved or come to realize many different types of social interactions. And online interactions nowadays are very, very common. I'm certainly involved in them. I'm guessing you're involved in them as well. We're involved in one right now, for example. The oxytocin system is absolutely threaded through and largely responsible for those types of social bonds as well. And incidentally, Oxytocin is the name of the 5th song on Billie Eilish's 2nd album, Happier Than Ever. Violent aggression is entirely appropriate at a professional boxing match, provided it's occurring inside the ring and only between the competitors and within the bounds of the rules of the sport, etc. However, there are some things that tend to bias certain social contexts toward being more aggressive or less aggressive, and not always physical aggression. And those generally come in 2 forms that many of you are familiar with, which are alcohol and caffeine. Let's discuss caffeine first. Why would caffeine increase aggressive impulsivity? Well, the general effects of caffeine are to increase autonomic arousal, the activity of the so-called sympathetic arm of the autonomic nervous system, which is, to put it very much in plain language, it's the alertness arm of your nervous system. That is, it creates a sense of readiness in your brain and body, and it does so by activating the so-called sympathetic chain ganglia. Again, as I always remind people, sympa and sympathetic does not mean sympathy. Sympa means together or all at once, and caffeine tends to bias our brain and body to activate the sympathetic chain ganglia, which run from about the base of your neck until the top of your pelvis, and deploy a bunch of chemicals that jut out into the rest of your body, activate adrenaline release. There's a parallel increase of adrenaline in your brain, creating the state of alertness and readiness. That state of alertness and readiness can be for all sorts of things, not just aggression. However, when we are in a state of increased sympathetic tone, meaning more alert, such as after drinking caffeine, we will bias all those brain and body systems, the hormones, the chemicals, et cetera, that exist toward action as opposed to inaction. So put simply, caffeine can increase impulsivity. No surprise there. On the opposite end of things, alcohol tends to decrease activity in the sympathetic arm of the autonomic nervous system, tends to make us feel less alert. Now, initially, it can create a state of alertness because of its effects in inhibiting the forebrain. Our forebrain prefrontal cortex in particular has what's called top-down inhibition. It exerts a inhibitory or a quieting effect on some of the circuits of the hypothalamus, such as the ventromedial hypothalamus. The way to conceptualize this is that your forebrain is able to rationalize and think clearly and to suppress behavior and to engage the no-go pathway. It's telling you, don't say that mean thing, don't do that violent thing, etc. Alcohol initially tends to increase our level of overall activity by reducing inhibition, not just in that forebrain circuit, but in other circuits tends to make us more active. We tend to talk more than we normally would, move more than we normally would, but very shortly thereafter starts acting as a sedative by way of reducing activity in the forebrain, releasing some of the deeper brain circuits that are involved in impulsivity, but also causing a somewhat sedative effect. And then, of course, as alcohol levels increase even further, people eventually will pass out, blackout, etc. So what we've got with alcohol and caffeine is we've got two opposite ends of the spectrum. Caffeine increasing arousal and readiness and the tendency for impulsivity, and alcohol also increasing impulsivity, but through a different mechanism. I believe that, tattoos are, this has come as no surprise, are a literal expression of what we feel on the inside. And I'm not recommending this. Kids, don't do this. I started getting tattooed really young.
How young?
About 14, I got my first tattoo.
No way.
We did them ourselves. With India.
Your first one was
please
yourself?
Please no one do this. India ink and a needle. And we used to do these. It's really bad. They're called knick-knack tattoos, or we kind of would do this at home. Don't do it. It's really bad. You get bad infections. They're ugly. They blur. They bleed. It's not good. I started getting tattooed. When I was a kid and growing up skateboarding in the punk rock scene, there were these guys in the town where I lived. They called themselves the Yahtzee guys. I don't know why. I don't know what that was about. But they all had full sleeves, and they were super nice guys, and they were all into skateboarding and vehicles. And I just looked up to these guys. I thought, someday I want full sleeves. I've got full sleeves. I'm basically like neck to wrist.
So chest piece as well?
Yeah, but chest covered. Back's covered, yeah. Nothing on my legs, nothing on my stomach, ribs, yeah. Tops of my shoulders. And I got a big picture of Costello, my dog, back there. I've got a picture of his paw back there. I've got a picture of another dog I used to have. There's still some space for a few things. There's some things very personal to me.
Is that the reason that you prefer not to show them?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple reasons. I'll just be clear as to why. First of all, when I show up to podcast, it's the same way I show up to lecture in the classroom auditorium. And I swear on my life, this is my mindset and this is my mantra when I do it. I'm there to teach. It's not about me. It's about the student. It's about the people learning. I don't want it ever to be about me. I don't want the focus to be on me. Obviously I'm the voice and the person talking, but I really want people to internalize the information. And I do think that the tattoos, because they have nothing to do with the information, are a distraction. They're just a distraction. I don't know. It would sort of like be wearing like a bright yellow shirt or something. It's not my style. I prefer to kind of make myself disappear as much as I can and let the information come forward. That's, even when I gave scientific lectures, which I still do, of course, for my professor job, I generally liked the room to be pretty dark and I wanted the light to be on the data, on the slides. I was happy to do the voice, but I want people thinking about the data. So podcasting is a little different. So you come through as a voice, or on YouTube, a voice and an image, but I really prefer that it not be about me. Now there's a human element too. And I think things have changed a lot. When I was growing up, tattoos were not accepted. There are many work environments where if you have, for instance, where people prefer that their surgeon or their doctor not have tattoos. Some people might prefer their surgeon or doctor have tattoos. When I was growing up, if you had I never had one, but if someone had a nose ring, they had to cover it up with a Band-Aid or take it out if they worked at the coffee shop. Remember that? You probably don't. You're probably young enough.
No.
Or eyebrow ring. Trends have changed, right?
Yeah.
Things have changed. And I'm kind of old school because I'm kind of old now, 46. And the etiquette for me has always been to, and this is Lex does this too, is I personally find that if I can just show up as formal and consistent as possible, that people will at least know that I'm taking them seriously. So I don't really do it for me. I pretty much do it for the audience. And also, none of the tattoos are like that interesting. It's my dog. I really like raptors. I've got a bunch of birds. I have all sorts of different things.
Like raptors, like the dinosaur?
No, raptors like red-tailed hawks and blue. I like birds and things like that.
I had either dinosaurs or trucks. Yeah. Like, you really need to love Ford Raptors.
No Ford Raptor. I drive a Toyota 4Runner and I love it. I got one truck and I love that thing. Although with gas right now, you kind of got to wonder about having a gas-driven vehicle like a 4Runner. In any case, the tattoo thing, I would say for younger people coming up, just be aware that you can't control other people's perceptions either. And so, I always made it a point that I didn't want things on my knuckles. I didn't want them on my hands. I didn't want them on my neck. I didn't want them on my face. Do I judge people when they have them? No. But do I want them for me? No. I also think that, and this is very neuroscience-y, as a neuroscientist, that we have dedicated brain areas called fusiform gyrus. It's a face area that's dedicated to the processing of faces. Even if I just put two dots and a line in between them on a piece of paper, you see that as a face. When one puts a tattoo on their throat or on their face, it actually changes the way that the face is perceived, right? It almost looks like another mouth there, right? It's a very different look. It can be a little bit jarring. I'm not saying one shouldn't have it, but it can be a little bit jarring. It changes the look of the person forever. It's not just that it's above the neckline, it's that it kind of competes with the processing of their face in its normal way. And so for me, whenever I see somebody with a throat tattoo or a face tattoo, it's sort of like, it's hard to kind of orient around that. And I think there's some biology to that relates to that. But look, when it comes down to it, people need to be individuals and live their life the way they want to live their life. I've also never been that much of an iconoclast. I'm not, I grew up in the punk rock thing. I hate in-group, out-group stuff. I always had friends from a lot of different, friends that are jocks and hippies and punk rockers and, straight and gay. And I don't care as long as people are living their best life and they're not harming anybody. I'm great, go for it. I'm very laid back in that way. Of course, if people are harming other people, then I believe that liberty and independent freedom. Liberty is, one of the highest things, for me. So, but I don't consider myself a very judgmental person, but you can't always control the perceptions of others. So I would just think people should be thoughtful about what they want to accomplish in life in terms of a life mission, and just ask whether or not some of the permanent cosmetic changes they might make might align with, compete with, or be neutral for those life missions. My life mission is very simple. I want to teach people the beauty and the utility of biology. I'm going to do that today. I'm going to do that until I take my last breath in one form or another, because that's what excites me and that's what keeps the dopamine cranking. For better or for worse, there is a tremendous literature on the biology of social isolation and all of the terrible things that happen when animals or humans are socially isolated at particular phases of life. Now, for those of you that are introverts, you are not necessarily damaging yourself by deciding to spend less time with other people. Many people like time alone. I personally am an introvert. I get a thrill out of spending time with one or two close friends, but I enjoy a lot of time by myself. I like to socialize, so I wouldn't call myself an extreme introvert, but I know there's some extreme introverts out there. But when we talk about social isolation, what we're referring to is when animals or humans are restricted from having the social contacts that they would prefer to have. And to just briefly touch on the major takeaways from this literature, which spans back 100 years or more, being socially isolated is stressful. And one of the hallmark features of social isolation is chronically elevated stress hormones like adrenaline, also called epinephrine, like cortisol, a stress hormone that at healthy levels is good for combating inflammation, helps us have energy early in the day, focus throughout the day. But if cortisol is elevated for too long, which is the consequence of social isolation, the immune system suffers and other chemicals start to be released in the brain and body that are designed to motivate the organism, animal or human, to seek out social bonds. An example of one such chemical is a peptide called tachykinin. Tachykinin is present in flies, in mice, and in humans. And under conditions of social isolation, its levels go up. And because of the brain areas that contain receptors for tachykinin, people start feeling very aggressive and irritable after social isolation. Now, that should be a little bit counterintuitive to you. You would think, if you isolate an animal or human and then you give them the opportunity for social interaction, they should behave very well. They should be thrilled. They're finally getting the nourishment, the social nourishment that they've been lacking for so long. It turns out that's not the case. Chronic social isolation changes the nature of the brain and body such that it makes social connection harder, and it makes the person who's been isolated irritable, even aggressive with other people. Now, I don't want to go too deeply into the biology of social isolation because it doesn't actually afford us that much insight into what healthy social bonding looks like. So today we're going to focus more on the functional biology, dual meaning of the word functional, as opposed to the pathology of social isolation. However, I do want to point out that social isolation starts to deteriorate certain aspects of brain and body pretty quickly. But how quickly depends, again, on how introverted or extroverted somebody is. So if you're somebody who's socially isolated for the holidays or has been socially isolated for a period of time and is craving social contact, that is a healthy craving. And as we'll learn next, the healthy craving for social contact has a very specific brain circuit, has a very specific neurochemical signature associated with it, and has some remarkable features that you can leverage in social contacts of all kinds. I think some of the more important and exciting work on social bonding comes from the laboratory of Kay Tai. Kay is a professor at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies. She's an investigator with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And in recent years, I would say in about the last 5 or 6 years, her laboratory has made a fundamental discovery as to why we seek out and put so much effort into social bonds. And the key discovery that she made is that much like hunger, much like temperature, much like thirst, we have brain circuits that are devoted to what's called a social homeostasis. Many of you have probably heard about homeostasis before. Homeostasis is the characteristic of various biological circuits and even individual cells to try and maintain a certain level. It's most easily thought of in the context of hunger. If you don't eat for a while, your drive to pursue food and think about food and make food and spend money on food and indeed to enjoy food goes up. Whereas when you're well fed, you don't tend to seek out food with as much vigor or as much intensity. You wouldn't invest as much time, effort, money, etc. So homeostasis is the aspect of cells, tissues, and organisms to seek some sort of balance, to regulate themselves. In a crude way, you can think about the thermostat on your home as a homeostatic circuit. When the temperature goes up a little bit, it cools things down to maintain a certain temperature. When the room gets cold, it hits a certain level and a sensor detects that, it clicks on, and then the heat goes on to maintain a certain set temperature. So that's a simple way of thinking about homeostasis. Every homeostatic circuit has 3 components, or at least 3. One is a detector, meaning the organism or the thermostat on your wall has to have some way of detecting what's going on in the environment, all right, in the context of social bonding, whether or not you are interacting with others and whether or not those interactions are going well. So that has to be detected. That's the first thing. Then there has to be a control center. That's the second thing. And the control center is the one that makes the adjustments to, in the case of social bonding, to your behavior and to your psychology. So you'll soon learn that there are ways in which the more time that you spend alone, the more motivated you are to seek out the pictures of faces, the interactions with actual people, physical contact, and so forth. Now, that might seem obvious to you, but thanks to the work of Kay Tai and others, it's remarkable to learn that there are specific brain centers that are adjusting our psychology and biology so that we seek out bonds more aggressively, or maybe we don't because we are perfectly sated or satiated with respect to how much contact we've had with other people. Now, the third component of this homeostatic circuit is the effector. The effector is actually what drives the behavioral response. It's what leads you to pick up your social media and start scrolling. It's what leads you to text a friend. It's what leads you to call a friend or make plans, and what leads you to follow through on those plans. So again, those three components are a detector, a control center, and an effector. And as you'll soon learn, the neural circuit that controls this social homeostasis actually has a fourth component, and that fourth component is one that places subjective understanding as to why you are doing what you are doing and establishes your place in a hierarchy. Now, I know the word hierarchy can be a little bit of a barbed wire one because people immediately start thinking about boss and subordinate, or in couples, a leader and a follower. But when we talk about social hierarchies in the context of human interactions, social hierarchies are very plastic, meaning in one setting, one person can be the leader. In another setting, the other person can be the leader. You probably have groups of friends or family members where you're constantly passing the baton as to who's going to drive, who's going to navigate, who's going to pick the restaurant, who's going to clear the dishes, and who's going to do certain activities and not others. So hierarchies are very dynamic. And as a consequence, social bonding has to be very plastic and very fluid so that you move from one environment to the next. Even with the same people, you have to be able to make those adjustments. And in the case of the social homeostasis circuit, those adjustments are made by a particular brain structure. I've talked about it on this podcast before. It's called the prefrontal cortex. It is the seat of our higher consciousness, if you will. It's what allows us to place subjective labels on things so we are not strictly input-output. We are not robotic. Meaning, if you go to dinner with a friend and they are exceptional at choosing restaurants, well, in the context of the social homeostasis circuit, your prefrontal cortex would allow them to pick the restaurant because basically they are dominant over you in their capacity to pick good restaurants, at least in this example. Whereas as you leave that restaurant and perhaps you are navigating to where to get a drink after dinner or where to walk through the city, perhaps you have the better sense of direction. And so then the social bonding has to be maintained as you switch the hierarchy. Okay, so that's the role of that fourth element, the prefrontal cortex. You might be wondering, what exactly is this meditation? The meditation is very simple, and it's one that anyone can perform. What you would want to do is set a timer for about 13 minutes. I don't think it has to be exactly 13 minutes, but since that's what they included in the study, you would set a timer for 13 minutes. You would sit or lie down, close your eyes, and you would simply focus on your breathing. Most people are going to benefit from only doing that breathing through their nose, but if you have some sort of obstruction or inability to breathe just through your nose, you could probably also do it by breathing through your nose and mouth, or just your mouth. But ideally, you would do just nasal breathing for a period of 13 minutes, concentrating on that breathing. And concentrating, meaning bringing your awareness, your so-called interoceptive awareness, if you wanted to get really technical about it, your interoceptive awareness to a point just about an inch inside of your forehead. Now, of course, that might sound kind of gory to some of you. You've never actually been inside your forehead, but just about an inch behind your forehead is where you would want to place your concentration while also concentrating on your breathing. Now, here's the thing about meditation that all studies of meditation show, which is that unless you are a very experienced meditator, your concentration, your focus will drift away from your breathing and away from that location about an inch inside your head, inside your brain, about just behind your forehead. That will happen maybe every 10 seconds, every 20 seconds, maybe even every 5 seconds. But an important part of such a meditation practice to improve concentration and focus is that you are continually refocusing back to that specific location and refocusing back on your breath. This is something that, again, is not often discussed. People think that if you do a meditation and you're supposed to concentrate on your breath, that if your mind drifts, that somehow you failed in that meditation. But actually, that's not the case. A huge component of improving your ability to focus and concentrate by way of neural plasticity, rewiring of the circuits for focus and concentration, is the repeated return to a state of focus from a state of non-focus or diminished focus. Okay, so think about it like trying to drive down the freeway and staying between the lane lines, and every once in a while, because there's a bit of drift on the vehicle, maybe the wheels aren't aligned correctly or there's something else wrong with the chassis or the steering device, it starts to drift right a little bit, then you hit the rumble strip, and then you pull back to the center. That's really what a focused meditation practice is about, as opposed to expecting yourself to stay between the mental lane lines, so to speak. So if you're somebody who's going to do a practice of the sort that I described, 13-minute meditation practice every day, you'd want to sit or lie down, close your eyes, start to concentrate on your breath, focus your attention on a location about an inch behind your forehead, and then fully expect that at some point you'll be thinking about something else, and that's a cue to focus back to that location just about an inch behind your forehead and back to your breath. By doing that repeatedly over and over, what you're really training up is the network within your brain that indeed includes that prefrontal cortex that you're focusing on, as well as some other structures, the infratemporal cortex, indeed the hippocampus, a structure associated with memory, and other components of the neural circuit that are involved in directing our mental focus and concentration. Again, I can't emphasize the importance of this practice being one of focusing and refocusing. In fact, I would prefer to call such a practice a focus meditation, or a constantly refocusing, or maybe you all can come up with a better name for it. I'm certainly not that good at naming things. But this sort of meditation practice has been shown in the study by the Suzuki Lab and other studies to really improve people's ability to focus and remain focused. So much so that in the beautiful book, Altered States, they describe a number of different meditation practices, some a little bit longer than the one that I described, one that's 17 minutes, another one that's 30 minutes. Some people will meditate as long as 60 minutes a day, although that's quite a long time in my opinion. The point here isn't how long you focus or somehow trying to achieve total focus for the entire 13-minute or 17-minute or 60-minute bout of meditation. While that would be wonderful, and I think many people aspire to do that, that's a lot of hard mental work. I think for most people out there, including myself, a relatively short meditation practice of about 13 minutes in which you fully expect your focus and concentration to drift, but that you are continually refocusing is going to be the most effective, yes, indeed, the most effective at teaching yourself to focus and stay concentrated. In fact, I invite you to interpret every time that you focus off that location about 1 inch behind your forehead as an opportunity to refocus, and think about the refocusing as the trigger for teaching your neural circuits how to focus for extended periods of time. On a trial-by-trial basis, we know that when you fail at an attempt, on the next attempt, your forebrain is in a position to engage better. And this makes total sense, right? You feel that frustration, and you want to get the next one right. Well, you're harboring, or I should say funneling more neural resources. Your focus, that aperture tightens. Now you have to be mindful of that too, because when you have a failure and then you're gonna hit the bullseye. I'm thinking about a dartboard because I'm terrible at darts. Sober, I'm terrible at darts. I don't even drink. So that next trial, part of the problem is that focus can narrow so much that you can start to lose access to information that might help you if you were just to relax a little bit and dilate that focus a little bit. But in general, on a trial-by-trial basis, focus is the cue that your nervous system is going to be positioned to learn better on the next trial. Now, in terms of life experiences, gosh, I wish for everyone fewer failures and more successes. But, failures keep you humble. And I've had a lot of them. I mean, if people ever wanted and they, I'd be happy to tell you about. I've made a ton of mistakes in life, a ton of mistakes. Some of those were mistakes of persistence, like dumb decisions. It's going to change, and it's clearly never going to change. And then some were failures of misjudgment about other people or situations, and a lot of them were just plain failures, like the experiment didn't work, or it just wasn't the right thing. And you try and reframe those. I do think that we owe it to ourselves and to the people that we know to try and generate some wins here and there and try and help other people generate wins. In running a lab over the years, and I still do, you realize that you want your students to publish a paper and feel that success pretty early so that they can experience, A, how much work it is, so they pick problems wisely, but B, so they can feel that I can do this. And I think that this gets into the psychological as well. I think that, yes, failures help, but successes help. And there, I think, I function best in a team. And I think that for those of you that feel like you're fighting some challenge alone, I do think that there are great resources to be had in trying to access other people as sources of support. I think that that's a great tool. There's this whole scientific literature around social connection and how that can help us reframe motivation and goals. Anyway, maybe that's a topic to expand on another time, but failure is important on a trial basis. People who don't experience enough wins for a long period of time, the brain is a prediction machine after all, and they start to predict failure. So it takes a bit more work to wedge oneself out of that. I would absolutely anchor my physiology with morning sunlight viewing. I can't help it. You know what's interesting? I'll tell you very briefly. You know what's special about morning sunlight? This low solar angle sunlight. I don't think I've talked about this much on social media or on the podcast. There's a group at the University of Washington, a couple, Jay and Maureen Knights. They run a lab together. That sounds like a horrible thing, but they do it and they get along very well. And they've discovered that the cells in your eye, the neurons that set your circadian clock, make you alert during the day and make you sleepy at night and so on. Those cells respond best to yellow-blue contrast and orange tones. Now, this is important because when you go out in the morning, even if it's not at sunrise, but it's close to sunrise, or you look at the sun in the evening, what you'll see is yellow-blue contrast or orange, yellow, blue, orange, that old thing from kindergarten or first grade. That's not the color of light that you're going to see when the sun is overhead. Now, this also is really interesting because artificial lights, at least to my understanding, even the daylight simulators have not picked up on this. It's just about bright light. Someone ought to design something that can mimic this, but nature has done this beautifully for us. And so viewing low solar angle sunlight in the morning and in the evening is most effective because of those yellow-blue contrasts. Now, here's the really wild thing. Those circuits that set your levels of alertness and sleep, yes, they respond best to yellow-blue contrast, but what that tells us is crazy. What that means is that color vision was probably not related to color perception first, because all of that is completely subconscious. The pathways that do this are present in people who are pattern vision blind. So what do I mean? I mean that color vision likely evolved from a need to synchronize your internal state with the external world, and the best stimulus in the outside world to do that is yellow-blue contrast. In other words, our ability to detect color was first and foremost, and we understand this based on evolutionary genomics and so forth, to extract time of day information, not color of fruit or color of skin or anything like that. That's all secondary, which is wild and crazy. And this is yet another example of the way we think things work is not the way they work. It's completely 180 degrees opposite. And I'm just gonna give you a little teaser. I had a guest on the podcast. We haven't aired the episode yet. His name is Eric Jarvis. He works on speech and language. He also was admitted into the Alvin Ailey Dance Company. Again, who are these people? He's a professor at the Rockefeller. Anyway, I learned from Eric, and you'll learn when that episode comes out, that you only find elaborate speech and language in species that also engage in dance and song. And the genomics point to the fact that song and singing came first and language came second. And that led me, during that episode of the podcast, I wrote down in my notes, I was listening to him talk, and I wrote down in my notebook, it's just scrawled in big letters, it says, "I am so happy right now." I was just blown away. And it makes so much sense when you hear it, that the colors in the sky were what our system is trying to extract, not a perception of those colors in the sky, because they're informing us about time and orienting us in time. That song and the communication of emotional states would be simpler and more foundational than communication about specific patterns of language. When you hear it, suddenly it makes sense. But of course, we're human beings, and unless you're Eric Jarvis or Ali Crum or Anna Lemke, you think about all this stuff backwards. I happen to be an omnivore. My goal is always to eat high quality, minimally or non-processed foods, and to eat things in moderation. So I do eat some meat from sustainable sources or from organic sources. I eat some starches, and I eat vegetables, and I eat fruits. I try not to eat sugars, and I don't really like highly processed foods at this point in my life. That's me. That's what I do. But I'm certainly not dictating what people should eat. I know certain people are ketogenic, and I can say that for people who achieve ketosis and can get into ketosis, yes, indeed, there is a mental state associated with ketosis that will allow your brain to function and to think really clearly that many people find very attractive and keep them going back over and over again to a ketogenic diet. I'm somebody who, for instance, has not been in ketosis many times in my life, at least not deliberately so, but I actually will ingest liquid ketones from time to time because of the further cognitive enhancement or physical enhancement that I experience on top of nutrition that does include some carbohydrates. So there are a lot of different ways to approach all this. Whether or not you're a vegan, omnivore, vegetarian, carnivore, et cetera, the point is this. Your ability to focus, and in fact, your ability of neurons to encode specific information in your environment, that is, to represent what's out there in the world, is actually related to your blood glucose level. Now, here I'm setting aside the discussion of ketosis and ketogenic diets for the moment. But there's a beautiful study that was published in Neuron not long ago that showed that the tuning, that is the precision with which neurons in the brain represent things in our environment, is actually much greater when there is sufficient glucose in the brain. Translated into English, this means that when we are fasted or when our blood glucose is very low, we aren't able to perceive and think about things as clearly. Now, there's a twist to this, however. Many people who practice intermittent fasting, and I should say I practice a sort of pseudo-intermittent fasting. I generally eat my meals between the hours of 11 a.m. and 8 p.m., although sometimes there's some wiggle around that. Occasionally I have an early breakfast. I'm not super rigid about it. But I know there are a number of people who are doing longer fasts, or they're eating in a 6-hour window. We did an entire episode about fasting. You can, again, find that at hubermanlab.com. We'll likely have Sachin Panda, who's an expert in intermittent fasting, on the podcast. Intermittent fasting has a lot of different potential benefits. For some people, it's a convenient way to restrict their calories. For other people, it's a convenient way to avoid eating. That is, it's easier to not eat than to eat a small portion, so they opt for intermittent fasting, and so on and so forth. But one of the things that you hear very often is that some people like being fasted because they like the clarity of mind that it provides. Here's the situation. Neurons, unless you're in a ketogenic diet, really thrive on glucose. They love glucose. And as I mentioned before, your ability to think and perceive things is actually enhanced by having sufficient glucose in your bloodstream. So why would it be that some people experience a heightened state of mental clarity when they are fasted? I've certainly experienced that before. Well, I should say that provided you're well hydrated enough and you have enough electrolytes in your system, what tends to happen is that when you ingest food, there's a shift in your nervous system towards so-called parasympathetic mode. That is, the more relaxed, you probably heard it as rest and digest, although it does other things, a more relaxed mode that can indeed make us very sleepy. If we have too many carbohydrates, it actually can make us quite sleepy. However, if we have any food, if we have enough of it, that is, if our gut is full, it diverts blood to our gut and we become sleepy and we can't focus as well. So a lot of people really like fasting in the state of being fasted for focus and concentration because they don't have as much of that parasympathetic activation. They're just not as sleepy. And in fact, under those conditions, half as much caffeine will give you just as much lift as twice as much caffeine will give you on a full belly of pasta. And that's just the way that caffeine interacts with blood glucose. So what I'd like you to imagine is if you had a measure of focus from 0 to 10, these are arbitrary units, 10 being maximally focused and 0 being not focused at all. Imagine a U-shaped function, right? Where if you're very fasted, you're going to have a high degree of focus and concentration. But then if you ingest some food and your belly is full, your focus and concentration is reduced. But having enough blood glucose and maybe even elevated blood glucose will increase cognitive function. So there are two ends of the spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, blood glucose is relatively low and you're fasted and you can think and behave in a very concentrated way. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have a lot of blood glucose, or I should say sufficient blood glucose. You never want your blood glucose to be too high. And that allows your neurons to encode and perceive and basically allow you to think really clearly. So you sort of have to pick your condition. What do you want for your bouts of focus and concentration? I actually do both. So what I do is, as I mentioned before, I eat my meal sometime around 11 a.m., my first meal typically, unless I'm very hungry when I wake up. And so I will do my workout and one bout of focused work. I always think of this as my hard work early in the day. And I do that fasted. I'll be consuming water with electrolytes, maybe Element or other electrolytes, maybe some caffeine as well in the form of yerba mate or coffee. That's my first focus bout of 90 minutes or less. That is essentially done fasted. And then I'll eat. And then I do notice after I eat, I actually have a diminished capacity to focus. But then again in the afternoon, I will do another 90-minute bout of focus. And I'll talk about some of the tools I use to make sure that that bout of focus is optimal for getting the most amount of focused work done, whether or not it's mental work or physical work, although I tend to do my physical work early in the day and my mental work both early and late in the day. So to make this very simple, or as simple as I can for you, being fasted is great for focus and concentration, provided you're not thinking about food the entire time. And being fed is terrific for focus and concentration. It actually can improve neuronal function, provided that you didn't eat too much food. So one way to manage this is, if you're going to have a lunch, to make sure that you don't stuff yourself at lunch, that you're not overeating, and to not get quite so full that you push your nervous system into this parasympathetic mode and make it hard to focus in the afternoon. I know a lot of people experience a dip or even a crash in energy in the afternoon that make it really hard to focus. For that reason, I'll just remind people of a tool I've talked about many times before, which is based on the biology of adenosine and caffeine, et cetera, which is to delay your first caffeine intake to 90 to 120 minutes after waking up. I know that can be painful for certain people. I violate that rule when I'm working out very early in the morning. I'll drink my caffeine before my workout, which often occurs within 30 to 60 minutes of waking. But in general, unless I'm working out very early, I will ingest my caffeine 90 to 120 minutes after I wake up. So again, I want to emphasize that if you hear somebody out there say being fasted is optimal for focus and concentration, well, that is true in one context and perhaps ideal for a certain part of the day. And other people will say, no, neurons run on glucose. You need glucose in your bloodstream in order to get those neurons to be tuned, that is, to respond with electrical activity in the optimal way when you're reading something or when you're trying to perform exercise. Well, that's also true. And of course, you can incorporate both. In fact, as I just described, incorporate both fasted states and fed states in order to optimize my concentration and focus. Non-destructive ways to reset your dopamine and your energy levels, and do those at least every 3 days. So for me, it was kind of a tough thing to take a long walk or to spend. I used to work really hard on Mondays, really hard on Tuesdays, and I would not go in until the afternoon on Wednesdays, and sometimes not at all. And then I'd go in Thursday, Friday, and work really, really hard, and then not at all on Saturday, and then maybe do a little bit of work from home on Sunday. And I was very productive that way. Those breaks are absolutely key, and it's not encouraged so much in academic or tech or maybe anything now. I hear about so much stress and overwork. I say you just do it and define the culture and let the results and your focus be the thing that defines you, not how many hours you're in there. But I realize there's a huge cognitive load and energetic load. And for that, I do think these non-sleep deep rest protocols are where it comes in really handy. There are at least 2 faculty I know at Stanford, one who's a so-called Howard Hughes investigator, who's those are big deal appointments. They get tons of money, et cetera, and they do amazing science most of the time. These individuals certainly do. And they take 2 20-minute naps per day in their office. When this guy came and visited me years ago when I was at a different university, he took the time that we were supposed to meet in my office and talk about data. He asked if he could take a nap. And he gave a great talk that afternoon. So there you go. I do think you have to take control of your schedule and do those things. And I hope that helps. And then, of course, for some people, exercise and so on is the way they reset. I do cry, but again, about the things I mentioned before. I realized something, by the way. We just recorded an episode on grief. It hasn't come out yet. Fascinating topic. I realized at one point, by the way, I'll just give this away, that I thought I was really sad about losing them. I thought I would tear up really easily because I was sad about them. But then I realized, gosh, I can't believe I'm gonna do this. But I realized that feeling that I was feeling is the exact same feeling of love that I had when they were alive. So grief is love. And when you look at the literature, it's basically that, but your brain is freaking out because that map of knowing where people are in space and time, grief is basically a remapping of the space, where are they? Time, when are they? And then this kind of abstract map representation that we call closeness. And grief is this process of like ripping ourselves off of that. So in any event, what do I fear? Talking about things like this. What do I fear? quite honestly, my biggest fear, the thing that would just make me feel just horrible, is I fear letting down my friends. I have an amazing, I love my family and they're wonderful, but I have this incredible relationship to friendship. And I adore my friends, and I would sooner give up all my limbs and die before I would deliberately let them down. So there you go. That's what I fear most. This is a wild literature, and I love it, and it's changing the way that I do things. I thought that to remember things, you're supposed to get really, really excited, really focused, and remember them. And guess what? That's not how you do it. There are data, and there are stories going back to medieval times that they used to teach kids things and then throw them in the river. There's a beautiful annual review of neuroscience written by the late James McGaw, a brilliant researcher who taught me that in this review. And it turns out that if you want to remember something, you want to spike adrenaline after you acquired that information. After. That means the double espresso and the ice bath after you study for math. Immediately after. And you think about this, that makes perfect sense, right? Think about the one trial learning that nobody wants to experience, which is a car accident or some traumatic thing. You didn't get the spike of adrenaline first, you got the spike of adrenaline after. So again, I discourage the use of excessive stimulants or anything like that, but if you're going to try and remember information, you need to get your brain and body into a high autonomic arousal state. Literally, you need to deploy adrenaline into your system after you have made the attempt to learn some information. So much so that if you give people a beta blocker after learning emotional information, they don't learn it as well. Incredible. Just incredible data in animals and humans. This is the beautiful work of Larry Cahill at UC Irvine and James McGaw. So that's how I would focus on remembering things better. And it's also true that if you tell yourself that something's really important to you, you'll be able to learn it better. If you meet people and they tell you their name and you forget 2 seconds later, well, you should probably be thinking, and now I do this, I meet people and I think, okay, what terrible thing did this person do? Just try and spike my adrenaline or something like that. It's a terrible trick, but I haven't figured out a better way. But that's actually one data-supported way to do that. Easily a dozen or more studies in humans on that very topic. You hear all the terrible ways in which it's changing our brains, and I think that, again, we go back to this thing, is it the aperture that we're looking at? So is it the format that we're engaging in things? Or is it the content? Well, the way I like to think about the phone is the way that we've been engaging with the phone and the laptop for that matter, in staring into the small visual aperture each day, is sort of like walking like this all day long, right? We have this amazing ability to shuffle our feet and take small steps, or to take big strides, to run, to move. I think that's the sagittal plane for movement. I know it for the brain, but it always messes. The PTs are vicious people online, by the way. The PTs and nutrition people, I've learned to just not say anything about that. I'm not a PT and I'm not a physical therapist, and they do incredible work, but it's a very spirited crowd. And the nutrition thing is really weird it's just incredible. People are either throwing liver at you, or they're throwing celery at you, or they're fasting or they're not fasting. It's nuts. In any case, the social media and staring at a small visual aperture is changing our brains. Here's one way I know in which it's changing our brains, and then I'll tell you how to fix it. If you stare or look at something within 2 feet of you for a certain number of hours each day, your eyeball actually gets longer. And the visual image then is focused in front of your neural retina, not onto your neural retina, and you are becoming myopic, nearsighted. And if you look at things in the distance enough, guess what? Your eyeball changes shape and your lens will focus appropriately the image onto your retina. Takes some work. Kids that look at things up close too much and adults that look at things up close too much become nearsighted. And there's a beautiful set of clinical trials now where, mainly in kids, if kids get outside for 2 hours a day, getting a lot of this UVB and blue light that we're told is so terrible for us, but they get it from sunlight. they actually can reverse myopia or reduce the incidence of myopia, maybe even glaucoma, although that's a big maybe. So how much staring into a small visual aperture is too much? I don't know. But what we do know is that we are literally becoming myopic in terms of our vision, and we're becoming myopic in terms of our cognition. And then there's the whole business of what's actually contained in those tweets and those social media feeds and those news stories, which frankly, I feel like you lose either way. Whether or not you're in one political camp or another political camp, you're upset about half of the information out there. So I feel like it's, I'm not someone who knows how to talk about politics without stumbling. I didn't do well in social studies and this sort of thing. It just never made sense to me. It just felt like the prize goes to the person who can shout the loudest and the most coherently for a moment. So, but I encourage, of course, people to be politically active. And I vote. But the content is tricky to navigate, and I can't really speak to that, except that it seems to be bothering everybody on one side or the other or in the middle. And the format is something that we really understand. And again, I don't know of many people that are talking about this narrow visual window format thing. It came up more during the lockdowns when we were all inside a lot and not looking out at a distance. The data say to try and get at least 10 minutes of long distance viewing, so longer than 10 feet away from us, for every 30 minutes of close-up viewing, and not a lot of us are doing that. If you're walking to your car looking at your phone, you're definitely losing an opportunity. I know many people are curious as to whether or not caffeine can improve focus and concentration, and indeed it can. There is an immense amount of data supporting the idea that caffeine, provided it's consumed in the appropriate dosages, can improve mental performance and physical performance, and it largely does that through improvements in focus and concentration. The dosage of caffeine, of course, is going to depend on how caffeine adapted you are, how much caffeine tolerance you have. And that is going to vary tremendously depending on whether or not you ingest that caffeine with or without food, as I mentioned earlier. But there is a kind of general range in which we can talk about caffeine as being useful for focus and concentration. And the range is basically from 100 milligrams to 400 milligrams. I want to caution everybody out there, if you're somebody who suffers from anxiety or panic attacks and you're not used to ingesting caffeine and you run out and ingest 400 milligrams of caffeine in the form of espresso or yerba mate or an energy drink or in pill form, that is going to be very uncomfortable for you. You're going to be sweating profusely, your heart rate is going to increase, you're going to be quite panicked, in fact, or at least anxious. So be cautious with your use and adopting of caffeine if you're not already caffeine adapted. But most people do quite well to ingest 100 to 200 milligrams of caffeine prior to doing some focused work. And again, I recommend delaying your caffeine intake to 90 to 120 minutes after waking, unless you are using that caffeine to really jolt your system before a workout. Caffeine can, of course, be ingested in various forms, even pill form, but most people ingest it in the form of coffee, or my particular favorite way to ingest caffeine is yerba mate. It is important, and I should note that you should actively avoid the smoked versions of yerba mate, as they contain a lot of carcinogenic, cancer-promoting compounds. There's some great yerba mate brands out there. The most cost-effective way to consume it would be to use the loose leaf tea and to pour water over that. There's one particular brand that I like. I don't have any affiliation to them whatsoever, but I've been using it for years. It's Anna Park. It's an organic brand that is sold. I buy mine on Amazon, but you can find it elsewhere on the internet as well. Again, I don't have any affiliation to them. It's just very cost-effective, very clean. It doesn't have the smoked flavor. At least the one that I buy is not the smoked variety, so none of the carcinogenic compounds are in there, at least that I'm aware of. And I like the way it tastes, and it provides a very even lift and stimulant that I think certainly works for me, and that a number of people I know that have suggested to also enjoy. Yerba mate or caffeine also have other additional benefits. In particular, the caffeine in yerba mate and coffee and other sources of caffeine are known to increase the density and efficacy, that is the number and the function of dopamine receptors. And this has been shown in humans several times. So by ingesting caffeine pretty regularly, you're actually increasing the ability of dopamine to have this effect of increasing motivation and drive. I tend to ingest caffeine only early in the day. I tend to cut off my caffeine intake somewhere around 1 or 2 p.m. to ensure that I can get into a good night's sleep. But I realize that there are people out there that ingest caffeine as late as 2 or 3 in the afternoon and can still sleep fine. I will caution those of you that think that you can drink caffeine in the evening or nighttime and still fall asleep. All of the research points to the fact that the architecture of your sleep and the depth of your sleep is disrupted, even if you're able to fall and stay asleep. The sleep you're getting is simply not as good as the sleep you would get if you were to shut off your caffeine intake at least 8 hours before bedtime, and ideally more like 10 or even 12 hours before bedtime. But of course, there are practical constraints as well. Okay, so caffeine is increasing dopamine's function by changing the number and efficacy of dopamine receptors. But of course, it also increases our wakefulness, our alertness. And that is largely through the neurochemical systems related to adenosine, which is a molecule that builds up in our brain and body the longer we are awake. It's part of the sleepiness system, if you will. Makes us feel fatigued or tired. And caffeine also operates on the epinephrine, the adrenaline system. In fact, if we ingest too much caffeine, we'll sometimes get the jitters. Those jitters are really the sympathetic, as it's called, nervous system's bias toward movement. And our pupils will dilate. They actually get broader. Now, somewhat paradoxically, when our pupils get bigger, the pupils of our eyes, that is, our visual world actually narrows. It becomes more tunnel-like. A lot of people don't realize this. When our pupils are really small, that means we are relaxed. So if you ever see someone with really tiny sort of pin-sized pupils, they're very relaxed. If their pupils are very big, they're very dilated, well then they are very amped up. They are very, very alert. Caffeine increases alertness by increasing epinephrine, adrenaline release both in the brain and within the body. And so that's another way that it facilitates focus and concentration. I acknowledge that I've mainly talked to you about the negative effects of alcohol. I want to acknowledge that many people enjoy alcohol in moderation or even light drinking, the occasional drink or the occasional 2 drinks, or maybe even on average 1 drink per night, so 7 drinks per week. I'm certainly not here to tell you what to do and what not to do. I do find it immensely interesting, however, that first of all, alcohol is a known toxin to the cells of the body. Some of you might immediately say, well, wait, what about hormesis? What about this phenomenon where if we regularly ingest a toxin, it makes us stronger? In other words, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. Yeah, there's, some reason to believe that might be beneficial in terms of some forms of cellular resilience. Maybe, no. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. There are processes of hormesis in which, for instance, exposing yourself safely to increases in adrenaline through ice baths or other things that increase adrenaline can raise your so-called stress threshold. But here we're talking about cellular stress and damage to cells. So my read of the literature, and again, this is my read, and I invite others to, provide studies, or I would prefer actually collections of studies that point in the direction, if they exist, that alcohol can be beneficial. But my read of the literature, or I should say, my understanding of what I would call the center of mass of the literature on alcohol is that no consumption, zero consumption of 0 ounces of alcohol is going to be better for your health than low to moderate consumption of alcohol. And that low to moderate consumption of alcohol is going to be better for you, of course, than moderately high to high alcohol consumption on the order of 12 to 24 or more drinks per week. I realize that for most people listening to this, it's probably low to moderate alcohol consumption that is part of their standard repertoire. And I'm not here to give you justification for doing that, nor am I going to tell you not to do that. I would like you to consider perhaps, however, the negative effects that we understand and that are documented. For instance, the negative effects of alcohol on the gut microbiome and the things that you can do to better support your gut microbiome. The negative effects on the stress system, that HPA axis that we talked about earlier, and the fact that even low to moderate levels of alcohol consumption can increase our levels of stress when we're not drinking. And to think about acquiring some tools and, getting some proficiency with tools, behavioral or otherwise, that can help you with stress modulation that don't involve alcohol consumption. So again, the point here is to illustrate where the problems lie with alcohol consumption, but also what I've tried to do is to point you to some resources that can help offset some of those negative effects. Will they offset all the effects? I can't say that for sure, but certainly taking measures to offset some of the negative effects of any alcohol consumption that you might be having or doing is going to be beneficial to you. As I mentioned earlier, caffeine is consumed by basically most all adults every single day and consumed at very regular times each day. Caffeine can improve mental performance and physical performance. This has been demonstrated in tens of thousands of studies. When we ingest caffeine, provided that we don't have a lot of food in our stomach and that our blood sugar isn't particularly high, generally we experience an increase in alertness within about 5 minutes, and that increase in focus and alertness peaks around 30 minutes after ingestion of caffeine and persists for as long as 60 minutes. Now, this is assuming that one takes caffeine in pill form or drinks the entire caffeine drink within a short period of time. Perhaps the most robust finding across all of the studies that I've examined is that caffeine reduces our reaction time. That is, it improves our reaction time. It doesn't make it longer, it makes it shorter. So for instance, in a laboratory study where people were asked to hit a lever every time they hear a tone, you can greatly reduce the time between the tone and the pressing of the lever if people ingest caffeine about 30 minutes before they do that task. Now that seems like a trivial task, but this is also seen in the domain of sports performance and even in cognitive performance where people have to arrive at a particular answer to a question. And the answer to that question has to be pulled from their memory banks within their brain, their hippocampus, for instance, a brain structure involved in memory. And if you are asking people, for instance, to remember the capitals of different states or cities or to remember certain historical facts, they will do that at a particular rate, but if they've ingested caffeine within the hour prior, their ability to recall that information is much, much better. They are faster, and it does not appear that accuracy is reduced. In fact, in many cases, accuracy is enhanced. And that's because caffeine both works on the reaction time systems of the brain and body. I'll talk about the mechanisms for that in a little bit, but it also stimulates certain neurotransmitters and so-called neuromodulators within the brain and body that give the neural circuits in the brain that are associated with learning and memory a lower threshold to activation. What does that mean? That means that we are better able to access the brain circuitry involved in learning and memory when we have a certain amount of caffeine circulating in our system. So this makes caffeine an incredible performance-enhancing compound. Caffeine is known to have certain neuroprotective effects, and that is because of its ability to increase neuromodulators such as dopamine, but also other so-called catecholamines like norepinephrine. If you don't know what those names mean, these are molecules that increase levels of alertness, motivation, and drive. And so then, therefore, not surprisingly, the large-scale analyses of the relationship between depression and caffeine shows that provided people are not drinking so much caffeine that it makes them overly anxious, that regular intake of caffeine is inversely related to levels of depression. For somebody who's very driven, who wants to be the best, who has a milestone, I would say 2 cautionary notes. One, first of all, that's beautiful and that's wonderful. And that's a lot of what makes life rich. 2, one needs to make sure that along the way, you are registering the wins, the milestones, setting some closer horizon milestones.
Yeah. Yep.
And then the third is that the schedule of reward that works best for keeping people in a healthy state of mind of pursuit is one of the same one that the casinos use to extract money from you, which is random intermittent reward. Here's what I mean. The slot machine, it's not every 10 pulls that keeps people playing a win every 10 pulls. It's the randomness of it, right? As soon as you're ready to walk away, you get a win and then it keeps people going. We can apply this in our own lives, and this is especially true with kids. It's great to reward your wins, but every once in a while, take that gold medal and just don't say it wasn't good enough, but just go right back into living life and pursuing new pursuits. What I've seen over and over again is that people that are very driven become so attached to this dopamine reward system that they get they reach the milestone, and then they feel depressed. Well, why? Because dopamine is released by pursuit, motivation, and craving, not by reaching the reward itself. So the journey being the destination is a dopaminergic, as we say, phenomenon. One other major finding of the Harvard longitudinal study on happiness, as well as shorter term studies on happiness, is that much as you've heard, perhaps, that no one on their deathbed says they wish they had worked more, well, indeed, the total amount of time that one spends working does not seem to determine one's happiness. And yet I also want to earmark that result as one that we need to parse a bit more carefully, because work, last time I checked, and certainly for me, is the way typically that people earn an income. And as we just talked about a moment ago, income is often a way that people have access to or provide access for their family to things like recreation that opens up the opportunity for more social connection, right? So we have to be careful with how we interpret these blanket statements that have become very popular, that money doesn't determine happiness and that the amount that you work isn't going to determine happiness. It certainly is the case that if you earn more money from working more and that money is devoted to things that bring more opportunities for social connection or for buffering stress in other areas of your life, including healthcare, care for your children, care for yourself, recreation, other things that you enjoy, well, then I think it's a little bit naive to assume that work itself is somehow counter to happiness, which of course it isn't. And it especially isn't if we combine that feature of work with another important feature of the human psyche, which is this notion of meaning. Much of the psychology of the last century and still today focuses on this feature of meaning as a critical one in terms of what makes us happy and what doesn't make us happy, certainly in the long term. And I can certainly say for myself that learning and teaching and doing research in my laboratory brings me tremendous feeling of meaning and happiness. Some people consider their work simply a way to gain a paycheck, and other people find that they would do the very work they do regardless of whether or not they were paid. In fact, many people will do volunteer work and other forms of work for zero money. So this idea that money isn't important or that work is not as important as we deem it to be, that also needs to be considered from a number of different perspectives. I like the idea of authenticity without oversharing. Mm-hmm. Right? You're very authentic, but there are aspects to your life that I'm aware of that your audiences will never be aware of, and there are aspects of your life that I'll never be aware of. And so you're still authentic, but
yeah, which ones are you aware of? People are gonna wonder, like, what is? You think I'm gonna trip a sex dungeon? What is this?
No. But interesting choice of examples. No, but I think that people lose the careers on the basis of the movement of their thumbs, right? I mean, the chair of psychiatry at Columbia recently lost his position based on a response to a tweet. People can look that up. This is one of the most famous psychiatry departments in the world. And he put something out there that was very insensitive, frankly. And everyone that I talked to about it was like, gosh, that was very, very insensitive, not thoughtful at all. And he lost his job, right? Or at least had to step down. I don't know the specifics. So, I think I read someplace that more than half of the job loss due to online behavior is because people were trying to be funny. The reason I encourage people to get sunlight in their eyes, especially early in the day, is that it helps wake you up. It improves your mood, it improves hormone output, it improves focus. It's good for so many aspects of biology.
How do I do it without hurting my eyes?
And it helps you sleep at night. Okay, so what you want to do, people have different levels of sensitivity. You want to look in the general direction of the sun. Okay. If it's low in the sky, it's no problem. You could literally look at it like this. Now, the higher it gets in the sky, the more imposing it is, and you'll want to close your eyes. If it forces you to blink, you need to look away from it a little bit. Indirect light is fine on a really clear day.
Yeah.
If it's very, very bright and you need to blink. I'd say take your sunglasses off for doing this. Eyeglasses and contacts are fine. And after, 2-3 minutes, you're good. Mm-hmm. And if you're walking to work in the morning, it's a nice sunny morning, but the sun, it's New York, so a lot of the sun's blocked by these big buildings. you just get the indirect sunlight.
And that's okay too?
That's okay. But through a window, these tinted windows that are everywhere here, or through a windshield, it's not going to happen. It's just never going to set this mechanism in the ways you need. So if you watching a sunset, you can literally watch it. Yeah. Right? Isla Vista, we used to watch sunsets, right? Yeah. They'd disappear off Del Playa with the oil rigs out there. And for the people who don't know, there are these oil platforms that sit off the beach in Santa Barbara, and it seeps up all this tar. But it's very beautiful sunsets out there, and you can look directly at it when the sun is low in the sky. When the sun is overhead is when it tends to be really bright. Don't stare at it directly.
And what is the advantage of this? It just wakes you up or something besides that?
So you have neurons, nerve cells in your eye that connect, that when that sunlight hits them, they send a signal to your brain that's a wake-up signal.
Gotcha.
Improves your mood, increases testosterone, it increases metabolism, it lets you focus better, and it sets a timer so that you can fall asleep at night about 12 to 16 hours later. If you're not getting light in your eyes, if you wake up and you're just on your phone, that's fine if the sun isn't out. But if you're on your phone for the first 2 hours a day and then you get outside and get sunlight and the sun's already overhead, and you go out with your sunglasses on, that kind of thing, you're going to find it's very hard to fall asleep that night.
Because you're not setting the timer.
That's right. Oh. Think of the morning bright light as your wake up signal.
Got you.
Get as much sunlight in your eyes as you safely can throughout the day. I wear sunglasses, but not when I do this morning sunlight viewing. And then in the evening, try and catch some sun before it goes down. In the winter, obviously, that's going to happen earlier. Yeah. And then at night, you really want to try and dim the lights. I always say like the fighters at the fight last night, like wearing sunglasses. Yeah. Dim the lights, dim the screens between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. Now, look, you guys were at the fight last night. I happen to be there too. I'm sort of a new UFC fan, so I'm not very educated on this, but it was really bright. It's not a big deal every once in a while to stay up late. I was up till 1:30, which for me is very late. But I would say 80% of the days and nights of your life, get some sunlight in your eyes and try and dim the lights at night. But you're in New York, bright lights, big city, right? So you're going to have to do a little bit more sunlight viewing in the early part of the day. Okay. And if you wake up and the sun isn't out yet, once it's out, get out there.
Okay.
It has huge outsized positive effects on your health.
I get it now because I didn't understand it first.
Like a lot of guys and women say, I don't feel well. I'm having trouble focusing. I'm having trouble sleeping. Yeah. Before we could get into any discussion about supplements or hormone therapy or ice baths and saunas, all that stuff is great. But the number one thing for health is going to be quality sleep. And the best way to get quality sleep is to get sunlight in your eyes early in the day. And on cloudy days, when you can't see the sun, people always say, there's no sun here. I'm like, the sun is still there. Yeah. It's just, and you get a lot of sun through those clouds. Just get outside a little bit longer. I forget who said it. Was it like St. Augustine or something said that like a good life requires a constant reordering of our loves or something like that. I'm terrible at quotes, but constantly updating what it is that we are in love with for that moment. And then shifting to the next thing. Yeah. And of course, that serotonin system is vital. If we cannot enjoy the things that we already have and that require no pursuit, if we can't take ourselves into those moments of just really appreciating what we have and not just gratitude, but really savoring the experience of what we're in, we will never be able to go back to the goal pursuit mode as well or as efficiently. So it really is like the seesawing back and forth between like loving a good night's sleep, but also loving being the person who bounces out of bed in the morning with a goal, right? Loving like being, for me, like just being a total sloth all day, 1 day a week. I mean, I turn into I literally think about the animal, the sloth. I even have a sloth on it that day. It's ridiculous. But I literally take a full day of each week and try and just enjoy being in the microscope of like just hanging around and doing that. I don't always achieve that because of life constraints, but then also on Monday morning or Sunday, if it were, whatever your schedule is, really putting, the goal in the crosshairs and getting that dopamine system ramped up again. When I was a kid, I had a little bit of a grunting tic. When I was 5 or 6, I would feel this buildup of tension in my throat and I would do this grunting tic. If I get very tired, I start to do it still. We actually know that this is related to these basal ganglia circuits for go, no go. You've got an accelerator and a brake basically in your neural circuitry. And kids with Tourette's and OCD, the brake doesn't work quite as well. And so one thing that happens is if I wake up in the morning and especially if I'm well rested, Well, if I'm not well rested, I do a hypnosis or yoga nidra in order to recover my sleep. That works really well. But then once I'm into the process of preparing the podcast, I've already gone through my notes. I know what I want to say more or less in a kind of general contour. And then I take a walk and I try to, so no phone with me, and I try to assess whether or not my energy is too high or too low for podcasting. Mm-hmm. Because when you podcast, as you know, you have to punch out a lot of material, but then there's times when you really need to slow down and emphasize and articulate. And so what I do, I've never revealed this. What I do actually is I will recite the lyrics of songs for about 10 minutes, songs I love, while I walk out loud.
It calms you and focuses you. What does it do for you?
I think it gets my vocal cords warmed up. And it also...
Do you sing or speak them?
I often sing them. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, nobody hears. And as I do this, I start to evaluate whether or not I'm straining to get the words out or whether or not I'm straining to make them slow enough so that I can articulate them. So there are days when I have so much energy that I'm trying to speak faster than I should in order to articulate properly. There are other days when I'm tired and I can't sort of keep up with my thoughts. And so what I try and do is assess that and then adjust the transmission, the RPM, so to speak. For instance, I can speak very quickly and then I can slow down. So I can change the cadence of my voice. And when you teach in the classroom, you learn, as you know, because you're an excellent teacher, I've watched your lectures in the classroom. As you teach in the classroom, when you want to slow down, every teacher knows you turn to the whiteboard or chalkboard and you start writing, right? It gives you a break. And then you turn around and you fire back the kind of machine gun fire of information, and then you slow down or you underline something. When you podcast, you don't have that opportunity, right? There are no visuals in my podcast. So what I try and do is always get my voice warmed up and make sure that I'm thinking and speaking at approximately the same rate. And then I also do this thing of I put my vision into panoramic vision when I walk, which is very calming. And then I actually start to remind myself of the purpose of podcasting. This sounds very mission statement-y, but you asked what I do.
Yeah.
I remind myself first and foremost that what I want to communicate, what I want to come through is the beauty and utility of biology. There is something called adrenal insufficiency syndrome, which is a real medical phenomenon where the adrenals are incapable of making these cortisol and adrenal hormones. But the truth is that you have enough adrenaline and cortisol in your body to last 2 lifetimes and 25 famines. I mean, we were built with a lot of robustness, right? This explains, the David Goggins of the world. We all do have that greater capacity that people talk about. The stress is very misunderstood because people think of stress as this ancient carryover that's very unfortunate. It kind of gets lumped with depression, like, oh, this is just a flaw in our design or something. But actually, stress is wonderful. It actually activates our immune system. So anytime you liberate adrenaline into your bloodstream, you also protect yourself against infection of bacteria and viruses. Because if you think about it, if we had to gather food and we didn't have it, and we had to then pack up and migrate long distances, you can't afford to get sick. And this is why people who work, and then rest, they usually get sick when they finally stop and rest.
Really?
Yeah, it's like the post-finals phenomenon in university or after the season or a game, or the caretakers thing where you're taking care of somebody who's ill and you're just work, or taking care of young children, and then you finally stop to rest, you go on vacation, and you get slammed with an illness.
Why is that? Because you're being in your comfort zone now? Or
because stress turned off. And adrenaline, so that the stress response recruits the immune organs of the body to release killer T cells. In fact, Wim Hof breathing, I know you're familiar with Wim, of doing 20 or 30 deep inhales and exhales, and also combined with some breath hold type work, exhale, hold, inhale, hold, is known to stimulate adrenaline release. And one of the better papers that's out there, scientific peer-reviewed papers, is a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences where they brought in 2 groups. One group did Wim Hof breathing. The other group did just mindful meditation. Both groups were injected with E. coli.
Right? It's crazy.
Right?
It's crazy.
Right? It's crazy. The meditators got fever, diarrhea, and vomiting. And the people who did Wim Hof either didn't get it or got it to a much lesser extent.
Felt sluggish, but
that's
not.
Right. They didn't. Right.
Isn't that
this
crazy?
Is not an experiment to do at home.
Isn't this crazy?
But it makes perfect sense because that breathing simulates a stress response. It stimulates cortisol and adrenaline, which signals
protects the body.
Right, which signals to the thymus, the spleen, and the other, the nodes of the immune system to liberate killer cells. And so when that bacteria comes in, the system is ready for it.
Your body is defending against viruses and disease, essentially. When you create a routine of healthy stress.
That's right. And we could talk about, we definitely you don't want stress on all the time. Sleep is really important, et cetera. But that stress response combats infection because it recruits immune cells. The problem with this whole dopamine thing in the context of relationship is that early on, it's incredibly intoxicating to the point where oftentimes people don't realize that they're veering so hard, right? And this is where the power of friends comes in very handy. This is also where we can honestly say that the power of complete and total disclosure about relationship to friend or therapist is really healthy. If you're saying I've seen this with some of my male friends. I have female friends too, but most of my friends just happen to be male at this stage of life. That's just kind of my surroundings. And I get the friend that's super excited about somebody, and they'll tell you this story about how say, and there was this crazy thing. She did this crazy thing, and they get kind of wide-eyed and like, that doesn't sound good. And he's like excited about it. Like, okay, this is his drug, right? It's uncertainty, it's excitement. And it follows a very predictable pattern where in 3 to 6 months, it's him complaining that she's crazy or that the relationship is a mess or that,
the original thing you loved, now you hate.
Exactly. There's chaos. So I think that here's the takeaway for relationships, not just at the beginning, not just in the middle. We can talk about the end in a minute if there is one, but to have an awareness where if you sense too much excitement in yourself or too much anticipation of how great someone is, I'm not saying don't fall in love, but be very cautious about the extremes of dopamine. Be very wary about the thing that makes you feel incredible. And I say this with some trepidation because I myself, love, right? I love love.
I love love.
But I love falling in love. It's the best. Love falling in love, love being in love. I mean, that's true in romantic relationships. And I also, I love having a bulldog. Like I love Tim, love. I have so many loves in life and relationships are always the best of it. Right. But there is this element where it is a bit of a drug, right? It's this thing because it's always about more. And if you really want the relationship, if you want good clarity on the relationship and you want it to last, there has to be a tempering of that. And I don't mean playing aloof. I don't mean canceling things last minute. I don't mean playing any kind of games with the dopamine reward prediction error thing. What I mean is just being aware that chemical state, it really is a what comes up goes down. And it also puts tremendous demand on the other person, right? That I think the key of any good relationship is to be able to toggle back and forth, ideally in together, through these more dopaminergic, like novelty, excitement, and then the more like really getting joy out of just being together, the more serotonergic stuff, like the just like, wow, the sweetness, the incredible, like the cocoon, and missing one another is super healthy. Also, remember, addiction is a progressive narrowing of the things that bring us pleasure, making sure that we continue to derive excitement from other things in life, even when we're falling in love. The concept of the muse and the concept of in a new relationship, we feel kind of indestructible and we can do anything in life and feeling so inspired. You see this
happy, joyful, excited.
Oh, I've seen this in family members. All of a sudden they're like working out again. And you're like, wow, they're using it. But the problem is it's all anchored. It's all tethered to this relationship, and the relationship goes and then the rest of the stuff goes too. I would say if I could travel back in time as a 15-year-old, I would encourage you to cultivate some sort of mindfulness practice. I know this sounds a little cliche, but having some awareness of your thinking about your thinking is good. But I'm actually not going to say sit down and meditate for 10 minutes a day or do NSDR. I'm actually not going to tell you that. I think given how plastic your brain is, how much it's changing at 15, I would encourage you, and maybe you would set a timer for this, to actually develop just a really keen awareness of what stresses you out, what relaxes you, what delights you, et cetera, and just to simply develop an awareness of that, because those are your antennae. And I certainly had a meditation practice as a youth, mostly given to me because I was a little haywire and I needed it. And it worked pretty well. But I think in retrospect, what I wish I had developed was more of a sense of, how I navigated stress or things I enjoyed and things I didn't enjoy. And I would just encourage you to have a general awareness, try and detect and learn about what raises your adrenaline, what raises your dopamine, what raises your serotonin, and then start thinking about tools. But again, the awareness is going to be very valuable. And gosh, as a 15-year-old, you are in this, amazing, blessed period of heightened neuroplasticity. Should we all be so lucky? So enjoy it. Sleep is the fundamental layer of mental and physical health. If there's one thing that we should all be doing is working toward sleeping long enough and deeply enough 80% of the time.
Okay.
I think that 80% is a good goal.
Yeah.
Because things happen.
Yeah.
Right? Travel happens, kids happen, illnesses
happen. The weekend,
happen.
you're going out, whatever, yeah.
Until you are sleeping long enough and deeply enough, 80% of the nights of your life, you are functioning suboptimally.
And what's the biggest risk then if we're not getting enough sleep?
Okay, so there are a number of risks to not getting enough sleep. Deficits in learning, deficits in the immune system, reduction in testosterone and estrogen in both men and women. So disruption of hormones, disruption of gut microbiome, increased cancer risk. There are a bunch of things. The severity of those things depends on a lot of other things too. Prior health, other health conditions, context, age, occupation. If you're not getting enough sleep and you're a high-rise construction worker, it's different than if you're an office worker. Okay, so we need to sleep enough. Now, what's enough sleep? This is an interesting question. Enough sleep has been argued it's 6 hours. Other people, it's 7 hours. Other people, it's 8 hours. It's basically waking up without an alarm clock and feeling rested. Insomnia is actually a medical term nowadays. And insomnia is essentially diagnosed as falling asleep during the middle of the day due to lack of sleep at nighttime.
Okay,
but many people who are having trouble sleeping at night are not falling asleep during the middle of the day. They're dealing with grogginess or crankiness or other effects of having fragmented sleep.
What are the main causes of not being able to fall asleep? Is it rumination? Is it traumas that you're holding on to? Is it arguments? Is it self-doubt or insecurities? Is it you nap too much? Is it the foods you ate too late? Like, what would you say are the main causes of not being able to fall asleep?
All of the above. But the primary one is a failure to turn off your thoughts.
Okay.
And I think that might provide a good anchor point for us to talk about some protocols. Really, an excellent night's sleep begins in the morning. I talked about this on the previous episode, so I won't go into detail, but everyone should get as much bright light in their eyes, ideally from sunlight, first thing in the morning, 10 to 30 minutes outside, depending on how bright it is. Eyeglasses or contact lenses are fine. Don't wear sunglasses if you can do it safely. If you wake up before the sun rises, turn on bright lights, then go outside once the sun rises. If you have no access to sunlight, use a daytime simulator or similar, like a ring light, and get that light in your eyes.
Okay.
So that's all of that in a compact form. Caffeine. You can inhibit falling asleep with caffeine. You have to figure out when your threshold is. For me, I can drink caffeine up until about 3, even 4 o'clock in the afternoon and sleep like a baby.
And still sleep well.
Yes, and Matt Walker, our good friend Matt Walker, would say that my sleep isn't as good as it would be had I cut caffeine out earlier.
By like 11 or 12 a.m.
Right, and I want to acknowledge, Matt is the Michael Jordan of sleep science, and so I'm not going to.
You're the LeBron James.
No, and in fair, thank you for the compliment, but no, I'm not. I know a lot of the science and the protocols, but that's Matt's wheelhouse, and so if he says something, it's true, and if I say something, and our opinions conflict, it's likely to be something that the data are still emerging, or in that case, default to Matt being correct. because just out of due respect for his expertise. So caffeine, for some people they can have a 2 o'clock espresso, 2 p.m. espresso. Some people it's 4 p.m. Some people can drink caffeine at 8 p.m. and fall asleep. But there I would say it's problematic because you're disrupting the architecture of sleep and the brain waves associated with sleep, the chemicals and so forth. So get that morning light. Cut your caffeine off at the time that allows you to fall asleep. That morning light also sets a timer on your melatonin rhythm. So you have this gland in your brain called the pineal gland. That pineal is the source of melatonin. Melatonin makes you sleepy, but it does not keep you asleep.
Okay.
Melatonin starts to rise in the late evening and continues into the night and then eventually tapers off. This is naturally occurring melatonin release, not supplemented melatonin release. The fastest way to slam melatonin to the pavement and eliminate it in your system is to look at bright light for, I hate to tell you this, even a few seconds. So,
you mean at night?
At night is typically when melatonin rises.
Yes.
It's when it's released in the bloodstream and when it has this effect of making us sleepy. It does a number of other things too.
You want more melatonin at night, is that right?
You do. And if you wake up in the middle of the night or it's 8 o'clock and you decide you want to go to bed at 9, or it's 9 o'clock, you want to go to bed at 10, and you go into the bathroom and you flip on the bright lights, your melatonin levels just got crushed down to zero.
So having lights on is the worst thing you can do.
Yes, and it doesn't matter if it's blue light, red light, purple light, green light. Bright lights inhibit melatonin very acutely, and therefore you want to avoid exposure to bright lights at night if your goal is to be asleep. So the simple rule that governs all this stuff is when you want to be alert, get bright light in your eyes, ideally from sunlight. So that's true in the morning and throughout the day. And when you want to be sleepy or asleep, avoid bright light in your eyes. Now, many home environments don't allow you to have zero lights, and that's not actually necessary. You can just dim the lights in the evening. Ideally, you also avoid overhead lights because the neurons in the eye that trigger this melatonin suppression and so forth, they reside in an area of the eye that views upper visual space. So you could have desk lamps or and just dim those down. If you're going to work on a screen, dim it way down. Will blue blockers help? Yes, but if the light is bright enough, you're still going to inhibit melatonin. In fact, there's a much better way to maintain ongoing action toward a goal that also involves visualization. But it turns out it's not about visualizing success. It's about visualizing failure. The Balcetis lab and other labs have looked at whether or not people make progress toward goals of different types, whether or not they're thinking about the goal, they're thinking about that goal line and what they want to achieve, that long-term goal and all the wonderful things associated with it, or whether or not they're thinking about all the ways in which they could fail en route to that goal. Right? This is not typically what we are encouraged to do. Typically, we are told, don't imagine failure, push failure out of your mind, only focus on success, fake it till you make it, or it's a phrase that I absolutely hate, frankly, because it's not even clear what that means, and it's not even clear what the ethical form of that is. I think it means continue despite any anxiety or fear that things won't work out. But if you look at the literature, the scientific literature, what the Balcetis lab and other labs have shown is that there's a near doubling in the probability of reaching one's goal if you focus routinely on foreshadowing failure. You think about the ways in which things could fail if you take action A or you take action B, and instead, therefore, you take action C. You're supposed to think about how things could fail if you don't get up and run each morning if your goal is, say, a fitness goal. So let's use that as an example, because even though I realize people are in pursuit of many things, not just fitness goals and physical goals are a very concrete thing that we can all get on the same page about because they're related to actions. Let's say somebody sets a goal of running 5 miles 4 times a week minimum and as many as 7 4 times a week minimum before 8 a.m. Okay, in a previous podcast on habits, I talked about the benefits of not necessarily setting specific times that one will do things, but setting time blocks that one will do things. So you say before 8 a.m., you're going to run 5 miles, and that's going to happen up to 7 days a week. Okay. One version of this would be, okay, sit back in a chair and think about how great you're going to feel and look if you're doing this every day, how your health is going to improve, how everything's going to, your blood markers of lipids, et cetera, are going to improve. Okay, fine. That's the visualization goal of visualizing the endpoint. Turns out that is far less effective and maybe even counterproductive compared to thinking about what's going to happen if you don't do this? The negative health outcomes that are going to occur, the disappointment you're going to have in yourself, the fact that you're going to wait until 7:30. That's not long enough for many people to run 5 miles. You go to put it on your shoes, it's going to be pouring rain or even hailing or snowing outside. And now you're not going outside unless you're somebody who's particularly motivated to do that. Okay. So foreshadowing failure turns out to be the best way to motivate toward goal pursuit. In fact, as I mentioned before, there's a near doubling in the likelihood that people will reach goals of any kind when they're constantly thinking about how bad it's going to be if they fail. If we think back to the neural circuit associated with assessing value in our goal pursuits, this makes perfect sense. The amygdala, that center of the brain that's involved in anxiety and fear and worry, well, the amygdala is one of the 4 core components of our goal setting and goal pursuit circuitry. And there's no bypassing that. There is no one listening to this or watching this whose amygdala is not involved in their goal setting and goal pursuit behavior. And so while I'd love to be able to tell you that all you should think about is rainbows and puppies and all the wonderful, rewarding things that are going to happen when you achieve your goals, the truth is you should be thinking mainly about how bad it's really going to get if you don't do it, how disappointed in yourself you're going to feel, how it will negatively impact you, if not in the immediate term, in the long term, if indeed your goal is to reach your goal. So I want to emphasize that I'm not interested in encouraging people to flagellate themselves. I'm encouraging people to achieve their goals. And it turns out the best way to do that is by foreshadowing failure. And the more specific you can get by writing down or thinking about or talking about how bad it will be if you don't achieve your goals, the more likely you are to achieve those goals. Growth mindset, which is the academic discovery and laboratory discovery of my colleague Carol Dweck at Stanford, is the hallmark of growth mindset is really 2 things. One is I'm not where I want to be now, but I'm capable of getting there eventually. The other is to attach a sense of reward to the effort process itself. In fact,
don't reward the result, reward the effort.
That's right. And if you look at true high performers, people that are consistently good at what they do, they don't peak and go through the postpartum depression and crash and come back, and their life is a cycle of ups and downs, but really people who are on that upward trajectory consistently, those people attach dopamine to the effort process. And actually, one of her original studies on the discovery of growth mindset was these kids that loved doing math problems that they knew they couldn't get right. So it's like the people who love puzzles, but in this case, they knew they couldn't get it right, but they loved doing it. And incidentally or not so incidentally, these kids are fantastic at math when there is a right answer because they feel some sense of reward from the effort process.
Yeah.
Now, the cool thing about dopamine is that it's very subjectively controlled. We can all learn to secrete dopamine in our brain in response to things that are in a purely subjective way.
Our interpretation.
But it has to be attached to reality. So, one should never confuse
what is real.
Right. So if you're thinking about the effort you're expending. So let's say somebody right now is financially back on their heels and they're setting up a new business, for instance, and it's hard. If they can take a few moments or minutes each day to reflect on the fact that the effort process is allowing them to climb out of their hole potentially, that it's giving them an opportunity, that it's somehow they are on the right path, or if they're not in movement along that path, or at least oriented on the right path, they're not lying in bed all day.
They're taking a step forward.
They're taking a step. If they can reward that process internally, 2 things happen. First of all, the brain circuits that are associated with building subjective rewards and dopamine get stronger, so you get better at that process. And second, and most importantly, dopamine has an amazing ability to buffer adrenaline and buffer epinephrine. And what I mean by that is there was a study that was published in the journal Cell, excellent journal, Cell Press Journal, a couple years ago, showing that with repeated bouts of effort, we use and we release more and more epinephrine. It's kind of adrenaline, but in the brain.
With more effort,
every time you put in effort. So every time you make, for this, let's keep it, if I were to keep it in the business context, every time you write that email, every time you, let's see, it's a person who's a craftsman or a craftswoman, every time you're working in the shop and doing that, every bit of effort, you're taking a little bit of money out of this epinephrine account. You're spending epinephrine. Now, at some point, those levels of epinephrine get high enough that you feel like quitting. It feels exhausting. And this was done in a beautiful study, actually, where they control the visual environments and they have the subjects exert effort. And they can control the visual environment. So sometimes the effort of taking steps and moving forward, this is actually kind of pushing forward and kind of swimming motion, would give them the sensation that they were actually making progress. And other times it was an exercise in futility where they would just keep the visual world stationary and they would expend effort and they didn't think they were going anywhere.
My gosh.
Epinephrine's climbing, and eventually they quit. Now dopamine is able to push back on that epinephrine and give you, anyone, the feeling that you could continue, and maybe even the feeling that you want to continue. And you've seen this actually, like football is a good example. Two teams play, say the Super Bowl. Both teams are max effort the entire time.
Yeah.
Max effort. The team that wins suddenly, in a moment, has the energy to jump all over the place, party for days. They can talk. I mean, they have
exhausted
energy.
right before
That's right.
then.
Well, that wasn't glycogen or stored energy of any kind, except it was neural energy. And what happened was, effort is this adrenaline. Eventually, people quit. They just quit. The dopamine is able to suppress that. And so then you're expending effort, but you're doing it from a place of feeling like you have energy for it.
Because you made it this far in a video, I want to celebrate you. Most people start and don't finish. Most people never actually follow through. Most people say they want something, but they don't ever do the work to actually get it. But you are different. You are special. Believe Nation, you made it here all the way to the end, and I love you. So as a special celebration, if you put a hashtag believe down in the comments below on this video, I will showcase you and celebrate you somewhere on the screen in a future video because you are awesome. For 50 more amazing roles from Tom Bilyeu, check the video right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
Have a vision of the person you could become, and to reach the pearly gates, as it were, see who you could have been, contrast it with who you actually are, and be disappointed by the gap between them.